Hello and welcome to this historical review of Fallout New Vegas. I don't do standard game reviews on this channel in the same way that I don't do standard film reviews or television reviews either. Rather, my intention, as with all my reviews, is to read or understand them through a historical lens and critique them if necessary if they deviate too far from the spirit of history. But as for why I've decided to cover this game in particular, I find Fallout New Vegas wonderful in the sense that it is a vehicle to explore a particular time period and indeed to cover themes that I wouldn't cover elsewhere on this channel. Indeed, people who have been following the trajectory of the channel recently will realize I've just completed a 12-part series on the Habsburgs, so suddenly diving in to Nevada in the 40s through to the 60s would seem completely incongruous with that, but nevertheless, that's part of the reason why I want to explore the themes and the historical analogies brought up in this game. Indeed, I'm reminded of that famous Faulkner expression: "The best fiction is far more true than any journalism," and I think we can all agree to that in terms of what real life history and political sort of truths or whatever we can draw from the views put across and things represented in Fallout New Vegas. Indeed, I think it is fair to say that this is a lot of people's favorite game for various reasons. It's one of the best role-playing games that's been created for all time. It's certainly one of my favorite games, albeit I wouldn't consider myself a gamer by any stretch of the imagination. I haven't really played any new games since about 2014, but anyway. But nevertheless, one of the reasons that this game keeps hold of the imagination of especially the Fallout community is its political exploration, the stark contrast between the main factions, in particular the New California Republic and Caesar's Legion, and indeed the success of the game in presenting so many views which seem entirely antithetical to a modern conception of liberal democracy, and yet it does it with such finesse and subtlety in some respects, not so much in others, whereby players can actually justify the politics of whatever group they attach themselves to beyond simply the parameters afforded by role building. Indeed, as this is a historical analogy, I have to remark on one of the characters, Ulysses, and say, "Who are you who do not know your history?" And indeed, as it pertains to this stream and many of my other streams, if history matters to you, you'll need to earn it. And by earn it, you'll have to listen to however long this stream will end up being, how many hours this will last for. But anyway, to summarize what Fallout is as a premise, it's a science fiction premise, albeit with many uh, historical analogies, as I'm going to cover here. It is essentially a combination of many influences, but most prominent would be Mad Max and Doctor Strangelove. As it pertains to Fallout New Vegas, you can very much see the influence of like, The Great Gatsby or Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. As for what Tim Kaine, the creator of the Fallout series, intended, there is a introduction voiced by Ron Perlman at the beginning and the end of the games, and Fallout is famous for their ending slides. War never changes, which of course is just a commentary on the potential savagery and the Hobbesian state of nature of the war against all in a post-apocalyptic setting, but how these are simply continuations of themes derived from the Great War period that preceded the post-apocalypse. But nevertheless, as it pertains to Fallout New Vegas, war never changes goes into men do through the roads they walk. And very much a consistent feature of Fallout New Vegas is the courier, the player character, following in the mold of other great men who have decided to shape the barren wasteland landscape and define it in their own image. which is very much going to be the theme I want to cover at the end of the stream, especially as it pertains to someone like Ulysses basically referring to this, and Caesar referring to this as part of a historical process, explicitly referring to this as a historical process, and indeed how one figure can change the course of history. Indeed, in the case where civilization has, in most places around the world, collapsed, the opportunities to basically take the blank slate, take the putty of the post-apocalyptic setting and fashion it into whatever you want is very much a possibility. As for the legacy of this series, the plot of Fallout 1, which precedes Fallout New Vegas, is focused around a vault dweller engaging with an army of genetically modified superhumans known as the super mutants. And ultimately, this leads into a conflict with a figure known as the Master. And I'll bring back as to why this is relevant later on. In the second game, Fallout 2, we have the Chosen One in opposition to figures such as Frank Horrigan and President Richardson. The premise is about saving the small Northern California town of Arroyo, finding a GEC, which is basically a terraforming mechanism derived from the vaults, and in turn defeating a pseudo-fascistic remnant of the American government known as the Enclave. And so from here, we arrive at Fallout New Vegas, albeit there is a Fallout 3 which preceded this, but I think it's fair to say that Fallout New Vegas, as per Tim Kane's own assessment, is the continuation of the story of Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, and indeed it also captures the spirit of the original games. Tim Kane, just for the point of reference, left the crew making Fallout at the beginning, just before the production of Fallout 2. But in terms of coming to Las Vegas or New Vegas in the game, I really want to stress that it was a pure stroke of genius to combine the setting of the post-apocalypse, associate it with Americana at the height of McCarthyism, post the Trinity test explosion, and the run-up until you can say the height of the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, etc., and take that as an analogy and superimpose it into a reimagining of the Las Vegas setting. I'm going to be referencing various articles for the stream, but the one I'm reading from now is Ken Cooper's Zero Pays the House, Las Vegas novel, and the Atomic Roulette. And he begins with a quote from A. Alvarez's The Biggest Game in Town. The casinos lie out there on the baked earth like extravagant toys discarded on a beach, their signs looping, beckoning, spiraling, and fizzing recklessly, as in the moment of glory, just before the batteries run down, which is very much the theme of the bright lights of Las Vegas, New Vegas evokes in the player when it comes to the setting of Vegas, in the sense that the wasteland is not so dissimilar from the Nevada desert. The history of Las Vegas as we know it almost exactly coincides with the nuclear age, beginning with the construction of Bugsy Siegel's Flamingo Hotel in 1946. In the 1950s, the city in the middle of nowhere suddenly found itself next to the Nevada test site, prompting one native to complain, "It annoys me to read about some statesman saying the world is living with the atomic bomb. Damn it, it's not the world living with it, it's Las Vegas." While this resident was correct about the radioactive fallout from nuclear testing, he underestimated the power of its imaginative association. Just as Nathaniel West F. Scott Fitzgerald and others have found Hollywood to be a fitting extrapolation of American culture, Americana, a new generation of writers came to use this particular conflation of Las Vegas and the bomb as the symbol and landscape, a microcosm of the Cold War and the attendant reign of terror. You can look at writers such as Tom Wolfe, Joan Didion, who I'm going to quote later, Norman Mailer, and Hunter S. Thompson, the author of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and even figures such as Stephen King, but all to demonstrate a unanimity in associating Las Vegas with the atomic bomb. For a quick development history of the game, just referencing again why I believe the setting of Las Vegas following the first two Fallout games is genius for that exact reason, the association between the city and the bomb and the height of the Cold War. The Obsidian creators, Obsidian Game Studios, which developed the game, were essentially the successors of the original Black Isle Studios, which created the first two Fallout games. They also produced KOTOR 2, which is one of my other favorite role-playing games from about 20 years ago. It stemmed from the cancelled Van Buren game, which was originally going to be the successor. And indeed, in terms of being able to justify and understand how the game has such a quick development time, it had a 700-page design document which was ready at the hands of the developers when it came to using all the lore and the factions, etc., and being able to develop that into the themes expounded upon in Fallout New Vegas. It is an expansion. It was originally intended to be an expansion to Fallout 3. However, one has to credit Todd Howard when he lobbied not for an expansion to Fallout 3, which would have meant that nothing like this could have ever been achieved. And indeed, there are many other expansions to Fallout 3. The closest you can say in terms of going to another sort of post-apocalyptic setting in terms of a city is the Pit, in terms of looking at a post-apocalyptic Pittsburgh, but there's nothing compared to the scale and sheer breadth and imagination. Indeed, the hours that one can invest into something like Fallout New Vegas. So it was Todd Howard who lobbied for the creation of a separate game. But nevertheless, it should be noted that as it was basically handed to Obsidian by Todd Howard's Bethesda, it was only given 18 months of development time, which explains in part why factions like Caesar's Legion were so underdeveloped as a faction. And Josh Sawyer, the game director, had intended for there to be more quests and locations east of the Colorado River. I also want to credit, in terms of the various inspirations and for the game, the lead writer, John Gonzalez, and Chris Avellone, the writer and author of the Fallout Bible, and the original game director for the cancelled Van Buren. So what is the plot? To put this very quickly, because I'll be expanding on this far more when it comes to breaking down the individual factions and characters and the geography. The game begins with a person tied up being assassinated by a Bugsy Siegel-esque reenactor called Benny, flanked by a group of tribals known as the Great Khans. It turns out later that the character who's being shot is the player character. You wake up and find that you have been dug out of your grave by a robotic apparition called a Securitron and handed to a local doctor in a Wild West town known as Good Springs. From there, essentially, the player is set off to do whatever they want. But in terms of a narrative through line, the character is very much encouraged to pursue Benny, the man who had just assassinated or attempted to assassinate the character by shooting them in the head. It takes you to various settings, to real world settings, which I'm going to talk about later. But ultimately, you pin him down in his casino in the Thompson, New Vegas. Benny, as it so happens, is the head of one of the factions in Vegas called the Chairman. The player has many options from there, but the whole premise of why the character was assassinated is that the premise is that the character is a courier attempting to deliver something called the Platinum Chip to a enigmatic figure on the strip known as Mr. House. And it's from the moment that the character arrives in Vegas that they're accosted by the three major factions to join them. A Frumentari, or a secret agent of Caesar's Legion known as Wulpes and Coulter, invites them to meet with a figure known as Caesar, in the same way that a character from the New California Republic attempts to invite the player to meet with their ambassador, Crocker, on the Las Vegas Strip. And there is also the invitation by Mr. House, the Overlord of New Vegas, for which the original delivery was intended for, the Platinum Chip. So you may go off and you may assassinate Benny, you may let Benny escape, and then you may deal with Benny's fate when he arrives at the camp of Caesar and assassinate him, crucify him, whatever. Whatever path you take, it is very much encouraged that Benny will die. I've never actually tried to see if there is a possible game route where Benny survives. which could be quite interesting. I think the only way you can probably manage that is on an NCR playthrough, or perhaps by cheesing or deliberately sort of screwing up the Yes Man playthrough. But anyway, from there, the player has the option of reshaping the power balance around Las Vegas in the Mojave Wasteland. There is a faction of slavers across the Colorado River aiming to take Hoover Dam. Hoover Dam, which is the main source of electricity and water, not just for Las Vegas, but for the new California Republic. So everything is focused on the acquisition of the dam. One can side with the NCR in terms of their desire to co-opt or destroy the other factions, as it is the same with Caesar's Legion. And indeed, when it comes to the house ending is basically a wild card intending to use the war between the NCR and Caesar's Legion as a smokescreen for Mr. House to take control of the dam for himself and basically use it as a way to blackmail the NCR effectively into paying exorbitant fees in order to fund the growing economy of New Vegas. And then, of course, the fourth route is to disassociate with all of these factions, ally with a reprogrammed Securitron called Yes Man, and take over the strip for yourself and form your own state according to your own sort of compass of morality. So that effectively is the plot of Fallout New Vegas. So now I want to get into the geography of the Mojave. And just to establish the setting, I have an article here from John Wills, Welcome to the Atomic Park, American Nuclear Landscapes, and the Unnaturally Natural. In Savage Dreams, environmental writer Rebecca Solnit described the assembly of physicists in the wilderness at Los Alamos, New Mexico in 1942. Los Alamos was the research station for the nuclear bomb. Like park planners at the campfire, atomic physicists played out future scenarios in their heads, anticipating how atomic fires would transform both material and political landscapes. The Manhattan Project had brought nuclear science to the West. Seeking secret, remote, and uninhabited terrain, military authorities had appropriated vast tracts of wilderness for the manufacture of the world's first atomic bomb. Stretches of New Mexico and Washington were regarded as barren, unpopulated, and readily available for atomic purposes. Like national park planners, atomic engineers superimposed their desires for vacant spaces onto the physical landscape. Native American nations and recalcitrant ranchers lost their lands during the expansion of military projects at Los Alamos and the Hanford Engineering Works in Washington in the early 1940s, and the Nevada test site in the early 1950s. Lecturer in American Studies Valerie Colletz labeled the process a form of nuclear colonialism. In their capacity to annex Indian territories, atomic pioneers resembled Euro-American frontiersmen. 19th century homesteaders, miners, town developers, and national park planners had all imagined the West to be theirs for the taking. Military and park authorities relished exercising dominion over their respective territories. Federal officials sought absolute control over the surroundings. Destruction was tied to the creative process, with the laying of strychnine and the spread of plutonium part of making the landscape. Although at the time hidden from view, the scale of transformation that accompanied the nuclear age proved far more reaching. The Manhattan Project engineers shaped vast expanses of the American West to match their World War and Cold War intentions. The Manhattan Project was huge in every way, from the budgetary expenditure to public deception to the Western lands appropriated for atomic testing. Secret cities were constructed. The wild Western landscape was refashioned to meet an orderly military remit. Art historian Peter Hallers located the Manhattan Engineering District as psychologically somewhere between an army base and a utopian social experiment. The Nevada test site, meanwhile, provided a massive outdoor laboratory for the advancement of scientific knowledge. Now, just reading that assessment of nuclear colonialism in the 1940s and 50s, bells should be ringing for people familiar with the Fallout series how applicable the real world history is thematically and literally to the setting of Fallout. When it comes to the Indian reservations and the ranchers, we have the combination of the Wild West or the Wild Wasteland theme. With the Indian reservations, we have the theme with the tribals, whether it be the Great Khans, Caesar's Legion itself, or the Scorpions, the Jackals, etc., etc. Indeed, we talk about the laying of the landscape with plutonium. We talk about the literal landscape in New Vegas being riddled with radioactive waste and the fallout from nuclear detonations, especially around Big Mountain. But then it comes to this idea of secret cities were constructed, and we talk about the advancement of scientific knowledge. This, of course, is an analogy for the Vault-Tec experiments dotted throughout the wasteland. As it turns to Fallout New Vegas in particular, there are 6 vaults, each with their own particular experiment. One is focused in terms of being able to massively increase the scope for vegetation without the need for good soil. One social experiment is basically predicated around will you effectively kill off your own sort of population if you're simply told to do so via a social experiment. Another experiment is based around using gambling as a premise to resolve all of society's problems, which is very much appropriate given the New Vegas setting and the fact that it was Mr. House who won that contest, won that vault, and filled it with concrete. And then we come to other experiments like the experiment of Vault 35, which are focused on testing how a society can operate in a tiny, overpopulated, confined area with ready availability of massive arsenals and firearms, etc. So in terms of taking that setting, taking the whole premise of the Nevada test site and this whole idea of the Vault-Tec utopian social experiment, we can see that recreated in the form of the vaults. But again, this whole notion also expands to other settings within the expansions of Fallout New Vegas. We can say, for example, look to Old World Blues, which is it's wonderful in many respects, but has limitations. Effectively, it's a parody of the mad scientist. It has all of these analogies to or references to, let's say, for example, Plan 9 from outer space, science-based exploration B movies from the 1950s. It's basically an ode to all of that, but it's very clearly an analogy to Los Alamos. It is a crater in the ground that is again meant to imitate this whole idea of carving out the landscape in order to conform to the whims of scientists. Indeed, the whole premise of that landscape, of the whole idea of the think tank, the various scientists that inhabit Old World Blues, Los Alamos, the Big Empty, Big Mountain, is that one has to prevent them from going out and expanding and carving out the wasteland using these similar utopian scientific experiments, using this whole idea of the massive outdoor laboratory. All of these things are recurring again and again and again, expressed through different factions and different characters in the story. But of course, when we talk about colonialism, from the historical point of view, we talk about the colonialism of the nuclear pioneers. We also talk about the colonialism coming from the Hoover Dam workers in the 1930s, which provided the impetus for the creation of Las Vegas, the massive amounts of tourism, which can represent another form of trying to create essentially a paradise out of nothing, an oasis in the form that what ultimately Las Vegas represents, but also in terms of military colonization, because the setting of Fallout New Vegas takes place amidst the attempt to annex the region of the Mojave, and control the strategic asset, which is Hoover Dam, to the New California Republic. You see the legacy of conscription. It is everywhere. There are military outposts, listening stations, the main base at McCarran Airport, all, again, indicative of this idea of the colonial efforts of the NCR. And then you have more insidious colonial efforts, such as the attempt by NCR squatters to effectively take over areas in the Las Vegas suburbs, such as Freeside. But as we come to the actual sort of, I would say, a broad overview of the geography, you have towns that I mentioned, such as Good Springs. You have super mutant enclaves, again linking back to Fallout 1 in Big Mountain and Jacobstown. You have the various strategic sites of Camp Searchlight, of McCarran Airport, of Nellis Air Base in the north, inhabited by an organization, by a group known as the Boomers, who are basically xenophobic, explosive nuts. You have refugee camps such as Bitter Springs. You have military outposts such as Camp Forlorn Hope. You have various towns which are peppered around this, all of which are affiliated with a particular faction. But in terms of, and of course, the image on the right here is that of Hoover Dam, the aesthetic of which is extrapolated, captured perfectly by the story. And indeed, the significance of Hoover Dam is as significant to the real life Hoover Dam. But also in terms of recreating the physical sites of New Vegas, you start off in Goodsprings, and the player is very much encouraged to take a certain route. Encouraged. Some players have tried to criticize the game by saying it's impossible. It's not impossible by any stretch of the imagination, but the player is very much encouraged to take a certain route to Las Vegas. And the designers were cognizant that they wanted to evoke the feeling of all of the most glitzy, famous, tatty landmarks on the road to Vegas. So the first major town you encounter is the town of Primm. Primm, of course, is a real place. You can see the image on the top left. You take real world locations and you flip them slightly. So Whiskey Pets here turns into the Vicky and Vance casino. Vicky and Vance, which is a parody of Bonnie and Clyde, a crime sort of a criminal duo who actually never committed any crimes, but nevertheless, that is sort of one allusion again to not only the sort of crime sprees and the mafia of the 1930s and 40s, but also to great heists such as Ocean's 11. There is actually a character or two characters hiding out, trying to imitate Vicky and Vance by launching a heist of one of the casinos. So all of this sort of kitsch value and these references are abiding everywhere in the town of Primm. Primm, of course, is controlled by a offshoot of a criminal gang known as the Powder Gangers, who are escaped convicts from the local NCR facility. But of course, on the other side, you have the Bison Steve Hotel, and as you can see, it very much evokes the hotel that you can see on the right with the same roller coaster ride. One goes through the desolate town of Nipton, which has been sacked by the Legion, and then one straggles up to the town of Novak. And the town of Novak is very much inspired by a real-world tourist site, which you can see here, which is the, if I can recall, oh yes, I have it written down here, the Cabazon dinosaur, which is the inspiration behind Dinky the dinosaur, which in terms of utilizing that landmark and turning it into a plot point, it becomes a sniper outpost. And one of the main followers in the game, Boone, who you can encounter and enlist to support you, is found to be one of the snipers in the dinosaur landmark. But now we come to the character moving out from Novak to Boulder City, the original city which was created by the federal government to house the workers of Hoover Dam. And yet, Boulder City in the story is basically a double entendre. You have the historic Boulder City, of course, but you also have the legacy of the first Battle of Hoover Dam between Caesar's Legion, led by Joshua Graham, the Burned Man, the Malpays legate, and Chief Hanlon of the NCR Rangers. But it is very much the ruined landscape, in other words, the boulders of Boulder City, which provide the perfect camouflage for a trap for the Legion to walk into, allowing the NCR to win that first battle. But from Boulder City, the player is given the cue to finally confront Benny within the Las Vegas Strip. So I want to use this opportunity to explain how much the New Vegas setting is indebted to the history of the real Vegas. As with the significance of the Hoover Dam to New Vegas, the historical Las Vegas was nothing more originally than a pit stop until construction began on the Hoover Dam in 1931. The dam would provide the impetus for urbanization. Workers on the dam would need a place to stay, obviously, and a place to be entertained. And as many of them were young men, either single or away from any significant others for that protracted period of time, owing to the fact that there was no significant sort of residences at the time that they could settle in, it became the site of early showgirls. It became the site of massive gambling dens. And it was the mafia in the final days of the Prohibition era that were quick to seize upon this opportunity afforded by the construction of the dam and the presence of all of these temporary workers. Indeed, the continuation of Prohibition actually made Las Vegas far more attractive to the workers than the federally controlled Boulder City, which had been constructed specifically for the dam workers. At first, the federal government responded by trying to limit worker movement to Vegas, and this involved eventually a crackdown on gambling dens and smuggling, for which the local city council was more than happy to oblige in order to limit the influence of the local mafia. But this only emboldened the workers to pursue Las Vegas, and it spawned the early Eldorado Day celebrations in 1935, which is a tradition which has been celebrated in Las Vegas on and off in many iterations up until the present day. When the Hoover Dam was completed, Vegas was South Nevada Power's first customer, and that meant what essentially had begun as a pit stop became the symbol of this massive. Eventually, it started, of course, in the administration of President Hoover, but it became a symbol of the New Deal. I forget the exact federal authority during the FDR days, but again, these massive building projects, not just Hoover Dam, but all across the United States, it became a symbol essentially of the New Deal era. As a result of that, as one of the new cities that have been created as a result of the darkness of the Great Depression. The mythos of New Vegas, therefore, is really that of the shining city in the wasteland, a prime tourist destination and attractive for NCR, a symbol within the game explicitly made by Sawyer of greed, of luxury, and indeed it is an ode to Americana, of pre-war American civilization. As electricity flowed to the historical Las Vegas, Fremont Street became known as Glitter Gulch, owing to the bright lights powered by the dam, again evocative of the whole idea of the ancient city of Las Vegas rising out in the middle of the plutonium fallout-ridden wasteland. But as it pertains to history, the dam workers had gone by this point, by 1935, they'd gone home. But what replaced them was a tourist industry, a very large tourist industry. And in 1941, the first casino resort was opened on the Las Vegas Strip. In 1951, the Atomic Commission detonated their first nuclear device at the Nevada test site. And as this is fallout, it is only pertinent to take the inspiration for the setting and explain the intricate connection between tourism in Las Vegas and how this affected the actual nuclear testing within Nevada. The Atomic Energy Commission announced bomb blasts at Las Vegas hotels, inviting gamblers to temporarily leave behind the neon lights of their casinos for other bright sites across the desert. The Nevada Highways and Parks magazine for late 1953 used pictures of Doom Town at the Nevada test site to promote tourism, the beleaguered, irradiated buildings offering a novel portrayal of state accommodation compared to the usual motel fare. So it isn't simply a matter that the nuclear fallout represents doom, it represents the apocalypse, but that was an explicit selling point of Nevada tourism. It wasn't just the original work on the Hoover Dam. It wasn't just the gambling. It wasn't just the prostitution, etc., etc. The very nature of the nuclear test siting and their proximity to Las Vegas became a selling point. And this is taken from Ken Cooper's Zero Pays the House. The fiction of Las Vegas is inseparable from its coincidental proximity to the Nevada test site and the manner in which the project was justified. From the beginning, there was a distinction between the official version of atomic testing and the inarticulate or subconscious fears about detonations and fallout. In a 1957 booklet distributed to anxious Nevadans, the Atomic Energy Commission calmly reassured them that your best action is not to be worried about fallout. Please bear in mind that it's extremely unlikely that there will be fallout on any occupied community greater than past low levels. How reassuring. The ASE policy of normalcy at all costs had been articulated as early as the 1950s, when a classified memo selecting Nevada as America's domestic test site addressed the issue of public opinion. Not only must high safety factors be established in fact, but the acceptance of these safety factors by the general public must be ensured by judicious handling of the public information program. The AAC carefully managed public opinion through films, brochures, the classroom, demonstrations, and even helped the Boy Scouts establish an atomic energy merit badge. Las Vegas businessmen were fearful that tests would scare away tourists and mount a similar public relations campaign. Now, if you look at the game, if you look at the tours, say, for example, given around the RepCon headquarters, indeed, if you look at the language regarding safety utilized within the vaults by Vault-Tec, it is very similar in terms of this patronizing glossing over of the extreme sort of effects that one can suffer as a result of radiation poisoning. These are all glossed over by these public opinion campaigns, these great PR campaigns, and again, even extending this, the absurdity of a Boy Scout atomic energy merit badge. You may look at the Fallout setting, see it as darkly comedic, see it as surreal in many senses, and it is. And there are elements of low fantasy which are also incorporated into the Fallout setting, but it is not so dissimilar from the real life experience in Nevadans in the 1950s. Las Vegas businessmen were fearful that the test would scare away tourists and mounted a similar public relations campaign. One chamber of commerce thought that the angle was to get people to think about explosions that wouldn't be anything more than a gag. The atomic hairdo was promoted, as was the atomic cocktail. And one photograph showed a bikini-clad woman brandishing a Geiger counter as she checked the beard of a grizzled desert prospector for radioactivity. Now, if that's not some bizarre sort of representation of the Fallout series in New Vegas, I don't know, especially as the player comes with a device called a Pip-Boy, created by Vault-Tec, which comes with an inbuilt Geiger counter to traverse the wasteland safely. Despite the appearance of normalcy, Las Vegas residents experienced indirect psychological fallout from the bombs. Casino managers noted that gambling increased around the time of test shots, as did the consumption of liquor. I'm actually reminded of, oh God, what's that ridiculous film? The Tim Burton film Mars Attacks, where, for God's sake, what's his name? Jack Nicholson is playing a character in Las Vegas. And I think there's a quote from him: during this time of intergalactic emergency, people still want booze and boobs. And of course, that is basically the real life assumption of the mafia, that it is during the nuclear test site we can actually use this to promote gambling and booze, the consumption of liquor. Once people became acclimatized to the tests, they started throwing dawn parties, drinking and singing sessions, which began after midnight and ended up in nuclear dawn. Here is how the pianist, the Desert Inn's Sky Room, described one such party. The Desert Inn, by the way, was the hotel which was bought up by Howard Hughes. They were drinking like fish. They sang as if they were on the Queen Mary and it was going down. Loud, desperate voices. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore, so I improvised some boogie-woogie that I called the Atomic Bomb Bounce. I kept playing it until I thought my fingers would fall off. Through a willing suspension of disbelief, the people of Las Vegas, like Americans in general, accepted the so-called necessity of atomic testing and Cold War escalation, while subconsciously fearful of their own complicity. So the whole post-apocalyptic setting, you can say, is actually built into the real-life Vegas. But here it comes to establishing the factions within Las Vegas that the player meets. The first hotel that one can actually see on the right here is the Gomorrah Hotel, obviously after Sodom and Gomorrah, which is owned by a faction, or run by a faction rather, called the Emerters, which house the sole proprietor of the Las Vegas strip, refers to as a criminal element Vegas used to attract. And that, in a sense, effectively is what um, establishes so much of the context for the story, that this isn't just an allusion to history in terms of the writers taking inspiration. This is a diegetic, in universe appeal to history. It's not just Caesar recreating the Legion, it is also House recreating the Vegas Strip of the 1950s and 60s. He looks at the mafia element and he sees it as an emblem of Las Vegas authenticity, so to speak. So again, in terms of impugning his judgment regarding this whole process, he is focused on the massive accumulation of wealth and on blind sycophantic loyalty to himself as the sole proprietor. He looks to the gangs running his casinos as employees, and yet his commitment to historical reenactment is such that he's actually prepared to reincorporate a criminal element, an explicitly criminal element, which ultimately ends up betraying him into the whole story of Fallout New Vegas. In terms of who these people are, the factions, the Emerters, the chairman, and then one final faction, which is very much indicative of the luxury associated with Las Vegas, the White Glove Society. They are nothing more than tribals that House takes together and gives them these old casinos to run. The original name of the Emerta clan was the Sliverkin. And again, one has to think in the same that we have Gomorrah, we have brimstone, we have various biblical analogies which are running through the life of the Gomorrah casino. The Sliverkin, of course, is indicative to the snake in the Garden of Eden. And of course, that being not just paradise in the sense that Gomorrah represents a faux paradise in the desert, but is an anti-paradise. It is taken out of the Garden of Eden and has essentially become a anti-Eden. It has become the paradise of vice and ultimately an analogy for hell. But in terms of the real life inspiration behind Omerta, Omerta, of course, is the mafia code of honor, but in particular, it is associated with two things: silence and non-cooperation when it comes to dealing with the legal authorities, the government in particular. So when mafia bosses in the 1950s and 60s would testify before courts or before Congress, etc., it was seen as a violation of this whole system of omerta, which effectively disowned you from the American crime families. And in terms of just how House views the emerters, this can very much be seen to be analogous to how the mafia treated the denizens and the tourists of Las Vegas themselves. So just to quote him, I don't think emerters saw other people as people at all. Everyone else was just prey. They reminded me of a certain criminal element Vegas used to attract. I told them some stories, gave them some clothes, and they ran with it. Like I said, a deliberate attempt to recover this sense of Las Vegas historical idiosyncrasy. But coming to Benny, as you can see on the image on the left, we come to the chairman, and their original name were the Mojave Boot Riders. But Benny is very much inspired by Benjamin, Bugsy Siegel, and with his collaborator, Meyer Lansky, built the Flamingo Hotel in 1946 as Vegas's first high-class casino. And you can very much see that this is indicative of the Tops Casino in Las Vegas, in the same way that Bugsy Siegel represents Benny. Meyer Lansky can represent Swank, who is his right-hand man, effectively, and will take over from the Tops during the course of the game. But in terms of just looking at the actual character of Benny and his own motivations, to take a quote from him, I'm head on, baby, flat out, all stops pulled, full steam ahead, side bets are for losers, I'm playing to win. In terms of Bugsy Siegel being a instigator, in terms of the, you can say, expanding the horizons for mob ambitions within Las Vegas itself, that the Flamingo Hotel was a test basically a test site for what later become the entirety of the Las Vegas Strip, even until today, albeit with the criminal elements somewhat limited compared to back in the 1940s and 60s. So the ambition of Bugsy Siegel, that criminal element, is very much apparent when it comes to the character of Benny. And indeed, Benny's whole purpose in attempting to assassinate the courier, take over the platinum chip. The platinum chip, by the way, in case I haven't mentioned, is a device used to upgrade House's Securitron army. The Securitrons are there to safeguard the strip. They're not there to intervene in the casinos. They're simply there to prevent people on the strip from killing each other. In that sense, there is a zero tolerance policy for violent crime, and as a result, tourist NCR officials aren't allowed to take guns onto the strip. But nevertheless, his plan, Benny's plan, is to take this chip and use it to upgrade the army and to take the army away from House and use it to control New Vegas. So in that sense, the arcs, essentially, of Bugsy Siegel and Benny, not literally, of course, but figuratively are compatible. Both characters are considered to be snakes, and they are ultimately assassinated by characters who consider effectively to have been betrayed by both characters. So their desires, their ambitions, their significance to Las Vegas, and indeed their fates mirror each other. Just to have a little background of Siegel, he was a member of the Jewish mob, along with Lansky, and held influence in the National Crime Syndicate and the Mafia in general. He began his career as a bootlegger, again, that reference back to Prohibition, but turned to gambling after the repeal of Prohibition. He later would win renown as a hitman, and he was tried for the murder of fellow mobster Harry Greenberg. So again, in the sense that Benny is prepared to take direct action to assassinate the courier rather than simply delegate it to a mercenary in the form of a great Khan. That is very much indicative of Bugsy Siegel's original character. This is, you can say, even expressed by Siegel himself when he boasted to the head contractor of the Flamingo Hotel that he killed people, but that he shouldn't worry because the mob only killed each other. The mafia backers of the Flamingo ultimately were convinced that Siegel had embezzled construction funds, and he was assassinated in 1947. Despite the death of Siegel, the Chicago outfit of the Italian crime family were quick to, and again, that's the crime family that was originally run by Al Capone in the 1930s, were quick to fund Las Vegas. Developers, with the support of union representative Jimmy Hoffa and banker E. Parry Thomas, flooded New Vegas with investment money. And this comes to other famous mafia characters that we see, which indeed can be analogies to all sorts of characters that we see within the New Vegas setting. In particular, I would say we have Lucky Luciano, Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, Frank Costello, Alan Smiley, Willie Moretti, etc. In the Gomorrah casino, there are three principal players. Indeed, you can say Cucino is somewhat reminiscent of Luciano. We have Nero, we have Big Saul. Again, they're very much obviously indicative of the Italian mafia and predicated around the Omerta Code of Honor, as they are themselves reconsidered to be the Omertas. But then we can look to other influences, such as the Godfather influence of a character like Mo Green. Mo Green from The Godfather is a combination of two real-life characters who had funded the Flamingo at Las Vegas, Gus Greenbaum and Mo Sedway, hence Mo Green. And you can say that, as in The Godfather, Corleone ultimately murders Mo Green. This can be mimicking, in many senses, the murder of Siegel, and by extension, the murder of Benny. It should also be referenced that, as with The Godfather and looking at the history of Las Vegas, one of the great boons to the Las Vegas mafia and the desire to put so much money into the makeup of Las Vegas as opposed to somewhere like Chicago or Galveston is that the original destination for this form of, again, libertine gambling tourism was Havana in Cuba during the time of Batista. But after the Batista regime fell in the late 1950s and we have the Castro Revolution, all that money which the Italian mob had invested in Havana instead went to Vegas, as was basically demonstrated during the events of Godfather 2. But now I want to come to the cultural legacy, which again is in full abundance when we talk about uh, the feel that the game is trying to get across in terms of its aesthetics and in terms of its music. From 1954, we have the funding of the Rat Pack, and you can just look at this association with the inclusion of Rat Pack actors in Ocean's 11, Bonnie and Clyde, again looking back to Vicky and Vance, and the music of the Rat Pack, who you can see on the left, were these archetypal, even in terms of our understanding today. I mean, most of you will have heard of all of these characters, archetypal in terms of being able to set the musical tempo and culture for the 1950s, which again is feeding into the whole basis of with the original creation of Fallout 1 with Tim Kaine, is that the 1950s should be used as a cultural analogy towards this period. In terms of looking at Las Vegas, that whole idea reaches its apogee. And in terms of looking at how these characters are diegetically woven into the whole makeup of New Vegas, as you enter the Vegas Strip for the first time, goes off with a bang, and you hear incredibly loudly Dean Martin's "Ain't That a Kick in the Head?" And when you listen to Vegas radio, you hear songs by Frank Sinatra, in particular Blue Moon. You listen to Nat King Cole, who isn't featured here but was associated with the Rat Pack, Love Me as There Were No Tomorrow. And of course, you have Bing Crosby singing Something's Gotta Give. Indeed, there is an explicit Sinatra link to Lucky Luciano in particular. And all of the fates, the careers of these people are very much associated with the mafia. So it's only appropriate that when we look at the Tops Casino and you look at Tommy Turini, who can say even perhaps be inspired, especially in terms of his look, by Sammy Davis Jr. that you see in the middle. And indeed, when you look at the Aces Club or you look at the Tampico, even the Sierra Madre Hotel, it's very clear that the game is trying to directly associate the talent, the era of the Rat Pack, with the connection with the mafia. Sinatra had a direct link to Lucky Luciano. And as I mentioned, The Great Gatsby as one of the inspirations for this period, it is clear, at least to me, that Sinatra was the real life Great Gatsby of Las Vegas. He was the glitz and glamour. He represented the cultural icon, both in terms of music and in terms of acting, in terms of his sex appeal. Of course, this preceded Vegas itself, but it's during the time of the Las Vegas ascendancy in the late 1940s and 1950s, up until the Kennedy assassination, that his links with the mafia were interwoven into the whole legend and the continued significance and relevance of Frank Sinatra himself. And as that front man, he was able to give Vegas that cultural cachet, legitimacy, again, panache, essentially, which continued to bring vast amounts of tourism and fund the growing engine of the mafia economy. And this is just taken from Ken Cooper to expand upon this a bit further. The Las Vegas mythos is twofold. On the one hand, the city is remote from the world, a hyperreal caravansary. A caravansary is basically an ode to like a Turkish or a Persian sarai or a court city in the desert. Sorry, just give me a second. Which is symbolic of a nuclear state, which has changed dramatically the terms by which we define reality. In their architectural study of Las Vegas, Robert Venturi, Denny Scott Brown, and Stephen Eisenhower observe that if you take the signs away, there is no place. Equally fascinated by the city's neon architecture, Tom Wolfe was also intrigued by a $250,000 machine built especially for a casino stage show, an instrument so advanced that it featured a mechanism used in Skybolt missiles. And listening to the casino manager speak, Wolf writes, one gets a wonderful picture of sex riding the crest of the future. whole tableau of bare-bottomed cosmonauts will be hunting around the Casino de Paris rooms at the Dunes Hotel at fantastic speed in elliptical orbits, a flash of the sequid giblets here, a blur of the black-rimmed decal eyes there, a wink of the crotch here and there, until with one vast project climax for our times, Sean Kenny, who used to work with his fellow Frank Lloyd Wright, presses the red button, and the whole yahooing harem shrieking "oh la la" amid the den exists in a mushroom cloud. And this isn't held back at all in the game. I mean, the whole premise for Gomorrah could be basically summarized in that one statement by Wolf. The game doesn't shy away from the extensive use of drugs and sex and violence in all ways, both in terms of looking at the confected glamour of the Gomorrah girl, the Gomorrah showgirl, but also looking at the horrific side effects in terms of getting prostitutes addicted to morphine. In the game, it's reflected by Medex. Indeed, there's a whole quest which is predicated around basically rescuing prostitutes from this, again, horrifying reality versus the glitz and glamour in Gomorrah, a character who I believe is called Joanna. And indeed, you have all sorts of these stories peppered throughout the game. Science has become the architecture of Las Vegas, Wolf concludes, and we might extend this insight to other aspects of the city. For example, A. Alvarez testifies to the magical power of the casino chip, which is like a conjurer's sleight of hand that turns an egg into a billiard ball, a necessity of life into a plaything, reality into illusion. The better adjusted to them you become, the further reality recedes. And again, that a metaphor for the platinum chip itself in terms of the whole dream associated, the project, the utopian project associated with House, in terms of his vision for the Vegas Strip associated with the illusion of the platinum chip. To hand over a couple of pieces of unimposing black plastic and receive for them $200 jackets is no longer a business transaction. It is magic. In this respect, the radical symbolic abstraction with the characteristic Las Vegas is analogous to the nuclear state, with its scenarios and war games, its probabilities, projected fallout patterns, and damage estimates, all of which exist as a strangely fascinating dominion, more conceptual than physical. Frantically, we wage simulated war to deter a real one, but the fervor of our play obliterates the distinction between simulation and reality. And this is the other aspect of the Las Vegas mythos, isolated from the so-called real world and apparently antithetical to American heartland values. The city is nevertheless irresistibly alluring, and once you are inside, impossible to escape. Mario Puzo warns the prospective gamer that unlike other gambling resorts such as Monte Carlo, Las Vegas has no beaches or medieval sectors at all, and shopping is limited to hotel gift shops which have outrageous markups. Again, this is perhaps expressed with Vault 21. You have to gamble, he concludes. There are no alternatives. Venturi, Brown, and Eisenhower argue that the casinos are in fact to be oases you don't ever want to leave. The combination of darkness and enclosure of the gambling room and its subspaces makes for privacy, protection, concentration, and control. The intricate maze under the low ceiling never connects with the outside light or outside space. This disorients the occupant in space and time. He loses track of where he is and when it is. Time is limitless because the light of the noon and midnight are exactly the same. The space is limitless because the artificial light obscures rather than defines its boundaries. And if you look in terms of the characters in the Vegas Strip, and even messages which are contained in computer logs throughout the NCR, or what is it, the NCR embassy, etc. You again have all of these characters who have come, they've been intoxicated with the oasis, and they give it everything, and they leave with nothing. And again, in terms of coming to the light, being entranced in that state, and leaving destitute, and many, of course, are brought to suicide by the experience. The developers of Fallout claimed that the Kennedy assassination, so that would have been in 1963, was the cutoff as far as the historical recreation was concerned. And yet they actually got Wayne Newton, the original Mr. Las Vegas to reappear as Mr. New Vegas. And of course, he became the headliner at the Flamingo Hotel from 1963 onwards and was a mainstay, a feature in Las Vegas life throughout the 60s and the 70s. But again, that represents a triumph in terms of that literal continuity between the character of Wayne Newton appearing in both. You can say he's basically the only carryover in terms of a direct person. Um, if you look at, say, for example, Elvis Presley features very prominently indirectly in the game. There is a whole faction outside of the Vegas Strip in an area called Freeside. They basically operate as a local gang, but unlike many of the other tribes in the Mojave, the kings are basically a benevolent tribe. They're there looking out for the interests of the quote unquote locals who can't get into the strip. So, drug addicts, basically the poor and downtrodden people who are basically denied access to the strip, which again is predicated on having a huge amount of credit in order to spend in the casinos. And you can say that the King's School of Impersonation, all of these Elvis Presley reenactors, led by the ultimate Elvis Presley reenactor, who is simply known as the King. All of this, again, is an obvious ode to the association with Elvis Presley in Las Vegas. But even though Elvis Presley was a feature in Las Vegas in the 1950s, when it comes to the song Viva Las Vegas, that song originates from 1964 after the Kennedy assassination. And then I look to the Great Elvis 68 comeback special and the return to the Las Vegas International in 1969, when Elvis, if I recall correctly, had 57 concerts in Las Vegas as part of his great comeback tour. So again, it's fair enough to say that it begins with the 1940s and carries through, I believe, to as late as 1969, 1970. And indeed, if you look at the influence behind Richard Nixon is clearly some form of inspiration that hangs over the setting of Fallout New Vegas. Richard Nixon, before he was vice president, was governor of California. And he is obviously the inspiration for New California Republic President Kimball. And of course, Nixon was elected in '69. You can even see this in terms of the his style of conveyance in his speech that he gives to the troops in Hoover Dam. And of course, even though Howard Hughes was a regular feature in Las Vegas from 1943 onwards, he didn't move there and become the template for Mr. House, really, up until 1966. So I mentioned all of these characters. I mentioned this appeal to authenticity, that this was a desired outcome by the sole proprietor of the strip, Mr. House himself. Um, and why all of these things are sort of connected. Indeed, you can say that this appeal to authenticity appeals to the dialogue of the chairman and Bugsy Siegel. There is such a concerted effort played by the developers in terms of being able to recreate that atmosphere of the 1950s. But in terms of Mr. House is where you take the real world character of Howard Hughes, who, in terms of a recreation of a biography, is perhaps the most prominent of all of the historical reenactments. And then this is very appropriate for me because of all the sort of great American billionaires. I think I'm more fascinated by Howard Hughes than any of the other characters. But as this pertains to what New Vegas represents beyond this mafia connection, beyond the entertainment attractions, and beyond the casinos for their own sake, and how that is somehow an allusion to the atomic age, I want to begin reading his own self-written obituary, which will ultimately be deposited by the Securitrons if House dies, which is a likely outcome in 3 of the 4 faction playthroughs. Robert House, age 261, again, that's a major plot point, president, CEO, and sole proprietor of the New Vegas Strip, industrialist, technologist, founder, president, and CEO of the multi-billion-dollar pre-war robotics and software corporation, Robco Industries, has died. Generally recognized by Mr. House to be mankind's only hope for long-term survival, Mr. House's passing may well sound a death knell for the entire human race. Lost forever is his bounty of knowledge concerning human longevity, the depth and breadth of which could, as he was apt to say, fill several textbooks. He was not exaggerating, though. He did achieve his goal of functional immortality. Let us not forget that he died at the age of 261. Also lost forever are House's singular personality, force of will, vision, leadership ability, the probability of an equally capable figure emerging from the current human population, because of course House was a pre-war figure, to lead mankind to a future of equivalent quality is less than 0.0001112% by objective measures, too complex to deal in this obituary. Personality and force of will. Born June 25th, 2020, House was orphaned at an early age when his parents died in a freak accident, autogyro, lightning. Though cheated of his inheritance, House attended the prestigious Institute in Massachusetts and founded Robco Industries on his 22nd birthday. Within 5 years, it was one of the most profitable corporations on Earth. In terms of his vision, by 2065, House was certain that an atomic war would soon devastate the planet. At great personal expense, he developed technologies to ensure the structural integrity of the city of Las Vegas. On the day of the Great War, 77 atomic warheads targeted the city. House defeated them all, and again, that's a bit of historical revisionism. Several got through, as he admits to the Courier, if he works for him. Leadership. Mr. House survived the war, of course, and would later recruit the three families, as I mentioned, the Emerters, the Chairman, and the White Glove Society, and negotiate the Treaty of New Vegas and rebuild the New Vegas Strip. While these achievements yielded many immediate benefits, they were all part of House's master plan to reignite mankind's quest for technological advancement, a plan without which the human race has nowhere to go and nowhere to turn. Which is the appeal he makes to the Courier as to support him. So, quick sort of assessment. That is the historical House in terms of how this pertains to the game. The game begins in the year 2281. He regains consciousness in 2138. He bides his time for over 130 years until he finally re-emerges and concludes all of these treaties in 2274. So what you see in terms of this reenactment of the old Las Vegas, the buildings and the structures are there, but it only perform this function for 7 years before the game actually begins. So obviously, as you can see by these images, you have the famous Howard Hughes photo in front of his Boeing 100, which of course was the inspiration behind the thumbnail for the stream, which, as you can see, is an image which is hung in one of his casino at Camp Golf. You have the Time magazine photo, which of course is very much the inspiration behind the screen of House which you interact with. The fascinating thing is actually, if you watch the making of documentary, that wasn't the original image they chose or the original image that was featured, but nevertheless they made the right choice, I believe, in choosing this one. And of course, something which only sort of adds to my sort of love of all the little details in terms of this direct recreation of Howard Hughes. The image on the bottom, on the right, is the last known photo of Howard Hughes. There have been many attempts essentially to recreate how Howard Hughes would have looked in the 1970s, but essentially the developers created their own interpretation of how he was supposed to look, which is this image on the right. And again, it may not be so different from the actual reality in terms of what I'm going to get into a little bit later. So how this reflects the real Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes didn't go to MIT, but he went to the California Institute of Technology. And he would become CEO of the Hughes Tool Company at the age of 19. And in the game, there is a reference to the fact that House was cheated of his original inheritance. He held an elder brother. It's possible that he was an elder half-brother who ran the H&H Tool Company, House and House Tool Company, which was one of the last attempted hostile takeovers or financial acquisitions by House. And indeed, there was a cut quest for House, which ultimately I think the game again suffers from not having, in terms of being able to piece together House's history in order to create a password which would have given you access to his stasis chamber in order to either deactivate him or to assassinate him. However, he was also involved in the film industry. He was involved in the production of the original Scarface with Al Capone and The Outlaw in 1943 regarding Billy the Kid in the Wild West. So again, House is one of these figures who has this romantic association both with the mafia and also with the Wild West. But it should also be noted this is something which I don't think the game can necessarily recreate, but it's something which is notably absent. We have the musical talent, we have the stage shows, we have the radio, but we don't have film. Obviously, if you look at the Rat Pack, the original founder of the Rat Pack wasn't actually Frank Sinatra, it was Humphrey Bogart. And even there's a character later who was, again, the sort of archetypal Hollywood starlet, Vera Keyes in the Dead Money expansion. There are many references to the film industry. One can't really talk about Howard Hughes without his production and his directing of films. And yet again, when it comes to how films play into the story and are most relevant, you have to look to Old World Blues. You have to look to someone like Dr. Mobius, who is an original sort of facsimile of ridiculous sort of 50s era antagonists in science fiction stories. But nevertheless, this I think is a notable absence. But all of the inspirations are simply taken and placed elsewhere. But it's interesting, isn't it, that Howard Hughes, even before he came to Las Vegas, fused these inspirations together. And I think that informs part of his decision why he became so fascinated and decided to buy up so much property. In the game, Robert House is associated with Robco, as mentioned. It is through Robco that he builds the robots, the Securitrons, which are able essentially to act as not only his enforcers on the strip, his diplomats and intermediaries for his negotiations, because he doesn't negotiate in person. He only negotiates via a screen in the Lucky 38 to the player, who has the best access to House and is potentially one of the only people who can see House in person as opposed to through a viewing screen. But it is again through the use of robots that House makes his fortune. And the analogy that one can draw here to the real life Howard Hughes is through the Hughes Aircraft Company. He was heavily invested, a pioneer in aviation, and later during World War II in warplanes. One can look at the Hughes XF-11 as one example. And he was also a very accomplished pilot in his own right. He broke the record for first for circumnavigating the globe by plane in 1938. However, there is also a darker element to Howard Hughes and indeed of Mr. House, which is demonstrated through the game. House aggressively takes over the Repcon test facility, the company which is predicated around the construction of rockets and rocket technologies. You know, you can almost say it's some sort of Werner Braun-esque sort of introduction, if I'm going to bring in the influences behind Doctor Strangelove as a parody here. But the tale of the Repcon facility is of House's desire essentially to turn the board of directors against the original founder and purchase the company, which, if you look at his later goals, seems to be intricately associated with his later plans for humanity. But in that sense, it is through Repcon that House best imitates, you can say, the pioneering aviation of the original Howard Hughes. But when we look at the acquisition and the purchase of Repcon and House's own attempt to take over the House and House Tools company, we see this in the purchase of Transworld Airlines. And indeed, in 1966, he would be charged with breach of antitrust laws for creating vast monopolies over these various industries. And the case automatically won because at this time, Howard Hughes was a complete recluse and he wouldn't stand before a court and plead his case. And that, in a sense, began the beginning of the end for the Hughes empire when he fell into his deep state of madness. It is from that period that Hughes began purchasing real estate in Las Vegas, very much, you can say, countering the influence of the mafia. And it is said that Hughes' intention wasn't just, again, using it as a real estate acquisition for its own sake, and since it was an entrepreneurial exercise, there was a deep connection that he felt to Las Vegas in terms of making it his home, in terms of him effectively squatting on all the penthouses of all these casinos he would later purchase. And indeed, his desire to take the original mafia version of the city that had been in decline following the JFK assassination and turn it into something more cosmopolitan, refined. You can say, if we're going to take an analogy from the game, to ultra luxify the process of sort of Las Vegas tourism. But he purchased the Desert Inn, and he purchased the Landmark Hotel. And if I'm going to return to this image here on the bottom, the Landmark Hotel was a real hotel that inspired, it was designed by the same person who designed the Space Needle in Seattle. But that is very clearly the inspiration, the Landmark Hotel, for Howard Hughes, who lives at the top in the penthouse apartment there. And indeed, there is also another more subtle analogy that I brought in. I mentioned the association between nuclear atomic testing, impending doom, the doomed city, and the ridiculous, preposterous reassurances by the Atomic Energy Commission. Well, Howard Hughes was known for his opposition to the nuclear test site, which, if memory serves, continued testing up until 1994, long after Hughes's death. But you can look at Hughes' own opposition to nuclear testing and see that as somewhat congruent with the fact the House would base his entire legitimacy around his possession and continued ownership, overlordship over the Strip, due to the fact that he was the one who defended the city from the original attack of the 77 missiles that were targeting the Las Vegas area, and the fact that he shot down most of them. That is his call to legitimacy. That is the reason why Las Vegas is what it is. It is that shining jewel in the middle of the desert. And that, I think, is, you can say, congruent with the fact that Hughes himself was, again, completely opposed to the continuation of using this this area with nuclear testing. Just a subtle sort of implementation there. But now we come to his madness, which can be attributed to many things. Brain trauma, suffered from various accidents in flying, obsessive compulsive disorder, extensive drug use, and syphilis. And just to have a little sort of excerpt from Ken Cooper again here. Even in his own Las Vegas kingdom, a man as powerful as Howard Hughes was no longer the most powerful invisible force. His biography writes, Hughes had finally found a menace worthy of his madness. He had spent years casting about for a danger to justify his dread, drifting from germs to blacks to impure water, and now his paranoia had become so finely tuned that it focused on the central horror of our age, that being the nuclear apocalypse. But again, it should be noticed again, germs, when you release him from his stasis chamber, or don't, or whatever, he is obsessed with microbial infection. And if you actually look at the real Howard Hughes and take that as the inspiration for his OCD, I think it's fair to say that House actually might be exaggerating the risks of microbial infection, despite his incredibly fragile physical state, simply if we are going to take this as a symptom of OCD and not simply a reflection of the limitations of his own life-extending technology. John Didion was intrigued by Howard Hughes and wrote an essay in 1967 about how we made a folk hero out of a man who was the antithesis of all our official heroes, a haunted millionaire out of the West, trailing legend of desperation power with white sneakers. Indeed, there is something to note about the fact that many of the characters will refer to the Lucky 38 as a tomb. Indeed, if you watch the opening for the for the game, it focuses on the empty casino, effectively, and it's something, an explicit intention by the game developers. They wanted to evoke this feeling of melancholy, of isolation, and of the fact that it was, in all senses, a tomb. Again, trying to recreate the feeling surrounding Howard Hughes and his own descent into madness. And we look again at the chamber, the image on the right reflecting the moribund Hughes, the long fingernails, the hair, the beard, the tiny, tiny weight, He was 6'4", and yet he weighed under 100 pounds by the time of his life. Indeed, I have to mention here there is actually a fun Simpsons reference when Mr. Burns decides to open a casino in Springfield, where he basically turns into Howard Hughes and terrorizes Smithers. But there are other analogies to other famous figures. It's not just Howard Hughes, even though Howard Hughes is the most obvious example one can draw for all the many, many reasons I brought up. You can bring in someone like Henry Ford, especially when it comes to, the car and the assembly line being a reflection of the Securitrons. But there is also a reference to William Randolph Hearst, indirectly through Charles Foster Kane, because one of the first things you may encounter in the game is a snow globe, and you get this omniscient message telling you that someone will pay handsomely for all of these snow globes. You can go throughout the wasteland and collect all of these snow globes from sites, whether it be the old Mormon Ford or Nellis Air Base or whatever. But the snow globe is not a reference to Howard Hughes. It is a reference to the snow globe and rosebud, the last words of Charles Foster Kane, which kicks into motion the events of attempting to recreate the life which forms the basis of the film Citizen Kane. Indeed, you can look to Lucky 38 and see it as Howard Hughes' Xanadu, if we're going to find some sort of more analogy there. But we take all of these vices, and what does the game do with it? What does it do to basically act as a contrast to it, and indeed to justify House's own power? Because House, in the days when, again, before the war, there were all of these stories around his, in particular, his weird sexual antics. And you see that with one example of a single sex bot which inhabits his penthouse. But again, how that actually achieves anything or whatever. In fact, if I recall correctly, there was actually cut content in the game whereby the player would be encouraged to simply stand and be viewed by Mr. House. And again, that would be the extent of his sexual perversion, which again is actually indicative of a character in Morrowind, Cassius Curio of House Halalu, who does the same thing, but nevertheless is basically replayed here and supposed to be an allusion again to the sexual proclivities of Robert House. But nevertheless, we take all that and we contrast it when he says, I have no interest in being worshipped as some kind of god, machine, messiah. I am impervious to such corrupting ambitions. So against all of that, Howard Hughes takes his own judgment, his impeccable judgment, and his own incorruptibility, and uses that as one of the many, many justifications as to why not only he should rule the Strip, but he had a claim on Hoover Dam as well. And one looks at this, and you look at, obviously, a libertarian monarchist premise. Trying to look at this, one of the first names that came to mind was Curtis Yarvin, and looking at NRX as this form of a tech CEO, monarch, cameralist, albeit unlike Curtis Yarvin's vision of that. Instead, they'll be ruling without an accountability to shareholders in terms of House's vision of pure autocracy. It's slightly different from Curtis Yarvin, but nevertheless, one can see that Curtis Yarvin is clearly something you can draw a comparison to here. I don't want necessarily to say that was an influence. I don't know. I would be quite surprised if Gonzalez or Avalone had actually read Curtis Yarvin, because Mencius Moldbug was, and the Mencius Moldbug was a thing before the release of New Vegas, but whatever. But just to put this in House's own words in terms of his mission statement on technology, New Vegas is more than the city. It is the remedy to mankind's derailment. The city's economy is a blast furnace in which can be forged a steel of a new rail line, running straight to a new horizon. What is the NCR? A society of people desperate to experience comfort, ease, luxury. A society of customers. With all that money pouring in, give me 20 years and I'll reignite the high technology development sectors. 50 years and I'll have people in orbit. 100 years and my colony ships will be heading for the stars in search of planets unpolluted by the wrath and folly of a bygone generation. And just that reference to the wrath and folly of a bygone generation, I can't help but look at that and just be reminded of the boomers. But anyway, the boomer generation, not the boomers in game. But that also explains the retcon link if we look at his mission, essentially to use Las Vegas as the launch pad for colonization of other worlds. I'm sure a lot of people will draw another comparison that Robert House is actually Elon Musk. You have the connection to Tesla, to new technologies, to SpaceX. To him, especially now that he's probably the second most powerful man in the world, and he's the power, or at least the media power behind Trump, that there are all of these connections that one can draw to Elon Musk and Robert House, albeit I think that's probably post hoc. I don't necessarily believe that was an inspiration at the time. It could have been, but it's clear in terms of trying to recreate that Vegas aesthetic that Howard Hughes was the most obvious comparison. And this also comes in to something which is relevant to both Curtis Yarvin and Elon Musk, which is libertarianism, because that's a core component of House's own mantra. To again quote him, I have no interest in abusing others, just as I have no interest in legislating or otherwise dictating what people do in their private time. And again, this is just pure sort of libertarianism in the sense that it's the no harms principle. So long as you have securitons making that sure that people don't kill each other, you can take drugs, you can have sex with prostitutes to your heart's content, effectively, so long as there is someone independent of that ensuring that you don't kill each other, effectively. And there is an element of far-sightedness, which I'm going to go into more depth. And just to take a quote from Hunter S. Thompson in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, this is one of the hallmarks of Vegas hospitality. The only bedrock rule is don't burn the locals. Beyond that, nobody cares. They would rather not know. If Charles Manson checked into the Sahara tomorrow morning, nobody would hassle him as long as he tipped big. Indeed, there is a horrific character you find during the Emeritus quest line called Clandon, who is completely unassuming. And yet you ultimately find that he is attempting to use chlorine gas to murder the population of the Strip. And not only that, he is a rapist, and he is a murderer, he's a serial killer, and he creates snuff films based on his antics. And that is tolerated by the Emeritus, that's tolerated by the mafia clans on the Strip, so long as basically Clandon continues to serve that function. Now it comes to House on power. When asked whether House would rule Vegas as a dictator, he would respond, I prefer the term autocrat. I would rule as a chief executive. I would not answer to a board of directors or any other entity. Nothing to impede progress. If you want to see the fate of democracies, look out the windows. But autocracy? Firm control in the hands of a technological and economic visionary? Yes, that Vegas shall have. I'm sorry for people listening if I obviously can't do it anywhere as well as René Aubergenois, the original voice behind Robert House, who died recently, unfortunately. But beyond Curtis Yarvin, I read this or heard this, and someone is mentioning Sam Francis, but I thought of Hans-Hermann Hoppe and Democracy, the God That Died. And in terms of him envisaging his new free economic zone of New Vegas, which is the basis behind his claim to essentially his plan for the Mojave. And it should be noted in the article that I'm reading, which is Political Economy of Monarchy and Democracy and the Idea of Natural Order, that at the time of writing this, Hans-Hermann Hoppe was actually the professor of economics at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Just another sort of weird reference one can draw in terms of the how this is all relevant. And the reason I want to read this article again is that if we're going to explore the history, we're also going to explain the theoretical and political underpinnings of the claims of these characters. I really want to get deep into that because perhaps many people have seen this as superficial readings of this, and I actually really want to get into the theory of what this libertarian autocracy would effectively amount to and how it can be justified, and indeed how Hans Hoppe's arguments can be seen as congruent with Hauss's own aims. The defining characteristic of private government ownership is that the expropriated resources and monopoly privilege of future expropriation are individually owned, which of course that is the whole base of the private sole ownership of the strip for House. The appropriated resources are added to the ruler's private estates and treated as if they were part of it, and monopoly privilege of future expropriation is attached as a title to the estates and leads to an instant increase in its present value. All of the estates, even though they are run by the three families, are owned directly by House, who takes most of the profits. And again, this is indicative of Howard Hughes and his own attempt, basically, of creating monopolies and him ultimately being undone by antitrust cases. Most importantly, as private owner of the government estate, the ruler is entitled to pass his possessions onto a personal heir. He may sell, rent, or give away part of his privileged estate and privately pocket the receipts from sale or rental. He may personally employ or dismiss every administrator and employee of his state. Now, the interesting thing here is one of the facets of House that makes him completely distinct from everything that is sort of brought up here, and indeed the whole mold of anti-monarchy, because what if you get a bad monarch? Well, House doesn't need to consider a succession plan because House is immortal. He has lived for 261 years. His technology is so complicated and advanced that when a follower of the apocalypse tries to get you to bug that technology so it could be used more with wider applications, it's impossible to configure. So hypothetically, he can live for the next 100 years to pursue his grand vision of Vegas being the launch pad, basically for colonization of other planets. But again, that whole notion, he can personally dismiss every administrator and employee of his estate. When he talks to the player, House very much looks at it as a employer-employee relationship. Yes, he will give the courier a lot of leeway in terms of being able to shape the Mojave at their discretion, but essentially, he does not view you as a partner. He does not view you as an ally. He will always consider you a subordinate, and that subordination is ensured by the fact that you will be richly rewarded for that process, and that is the same agreement that is reached with the tribes that form the administrators of the casinos. In contrast with a publicly owned government, the control over the government apparatus lies in the hands of a trustee or a caretaker. The caretaker may use the apparatus to his personal advantage, but he does not own it. He cannot sell government resources and privately pocket the receipts, nor can he pass government possessions on to a personal heir. He owns the current use of government resources, but not their private capital. Moreover, while entrance into the position of a private owner of government is restricted by the owner's personal discretion, entrance into the position of caretaker is open. Anyone in principle can become the government's caretaker, and what he does, Hermann Hoppe, we talk about that premise of the trustee or caretaker. It feeds into this idea of low time preference or high time preference between short-termism in politics and far-sighted vision in the case of House. And I'm going to use that later in terms of the assessment with the NCR, because part of House's pitch again is to look at the fate of democracy, see the end of the world. For these assumptions, two central, interrelated predictions can be deduced. A private government owner will tend to have a systematically longer planning horizon. His degree of time preference will be lower, and accordingly, his degree of economic exploitation will tend to be less than that of a government caretaker. And, subject to a higher degree of exploitation, the non-governmental public will also be comparatively more present-orientated under a system of publicly owned government than under a regime of private government ownership. And we're talking about the fickle nature, the expansionism of the NCR, and that being held in contradistinction to the plan advocated by House. A private government owner will predictably try to maximize his total wealth, i.e., the present value of his estate and his current income. And again, that's the whole basis for Hauss's plan. It is an economic engine more than anything else. He will not want to increase his current income at the expense of a more than proportional drop in present value of his assets, and because acts of current income acquisition invariably have repercussions on present asset values, private ownership in and of itself leads to economic calculation and thus promotes farsightedness. Indeed, one of Hauss's, again, claims is not only his farsightedness, but he can predict future events with near mathematical certainty. He even, again, supposedly predicted the day of the apocalypse. If I recall, sorry if my memory has failed me, October the 27th, 2077. However, he was unable to achieve to gain the platinum chip, which caused severe limitations in terms of his plan, and they wouldn't be rectified for over 200 years. So there are limits here, but it is that basis of calculation of farsightedness that informs Hauss's plan. It's interesting how again related this Hoppe's arguments seem to be with someone like Hauss. In the case of private ownership of government, this implies a direct moderation with respect to the ruler's incentives to exploit his monopoly privilege of expropriation, for acts of expropriation are by their nature parasitic upon prior acts of production and are part of non-governmental public. Where nothing has first been produced, nothing can be expropriated, and where everything is expropriated, all future production will come to a shrieking halt. Again, part of the whole nature of the plan is to build up the casinos, have that massive investment, create the whole network for which the tourist industry can pour into the Vegas Strip. And again, to add to that, with the access to the Hoover Dam, one can exploit the NCR for all it's worth in terms of being able to sell back water and sell back electricity. But the whole premise is that Hauss is playing for high stakes, but all of it with a long-term plan in mind. Accordingly, a private government owner will want to avoid exploiting his subjects so heavily, for instance, as to reduce his future earnings potential to such an extent that the present value of his estate actually falls. Instead, in order to preserve or possibly even enhance the value of his personal property, he will systematically restrain himself in the exploitation policies. For the lower degree of exploitation, the more productive the subject population will be, and the more productive the population, the higher will be the value of the ruler's parasitic monopoly of expropriation. But as the government's private owner, it is an interest to draw parasitically on a growing, increasingly productive and prosperous non-government economy, as this would effortlessly also increase his own wealth and prosperity, and the degree of exploitation thus would tend to be low. Hence why he's prepared to give so much money to the Vegas tribes and also the courier. Moreover, private ownership of government implies moderation and farsightedness yet for another reason. All private property is by definition exclusive property. He owns property, is entitled to exclude everyone else from its use and enjoyment, and he is at liberty to choose with whom, if anyone, he is willing to share in its usage. The limitation essentially to this is how he deals with the NCR. The whole pursuit essentially of his plan within the Mojave Wasteland is to see whether effectively he can exclusively determine his relationship with the NCR in the same employee-employer relationship that he has with all of his other vassals. Typically, he will include his family and exclude all others, except his invited guests or paid employees or contractors, hence the families and the courier. Only the ruling family, and to a minor extent its friends, employees, or business partners, share the enjoyment of the expropriated resources and can thus lead to a parasitic life. Hence, again, why there are so few people who share in the power of Hauss, and he wouldn't even consider it sharing. Backed again by the power of the Securitrons, who are, again, his ability essentially to he can inform essentially this whole idea of the monopolization of violence and him having to limit essentially his use or dependence on vassals, and the fact that yes, he has employees, but through the miracle of science fiction, he basically has the ability to singularly enforce security on the strip and monopolize an army simply at the command of a button. Because of these restrictions regarding entrance into government and exclusive status of the individual ruler and family, private ownership stimulates the development of a clear class consciousness on the part of the non-governmental public and promotes the opposition and resistance to any expansion of government's exploitative power. A clear-cut distinction between few rulers on the one hand and many ruled on the other exists, and there is little risk or hope of anyone of either class ever falling or rising from one class to another. Indeed, the whole basis of House's plan is to ensure there is no circulation of elites. Confronted with an almost insurmountable barrier in the way of upward mobility, the solidarity among the ruled, their mutual identification as an actual or potential victim of government policy, rights, and violation is strengthened, and the risk of the ruling class losing its legitimacy as a result of this increased exploitation is heightened. Ultimately, to break that down in Robert House terms, he has to appeal to legitimacy through his defense of Vegas, and he has to continue that sense of legitimacy through his ability to ensure security on the Strip, and by extension, security from all the forces outside of the Strip, including the Fiends in the west and Caesar Legion in the east. He has no interest in overextending his power, say for example into Freeside and Westside, until he has sufficient means to ensure that his power in those regions remains absolute. But again, talk about this idea of the distinction between the classes. This is palpable. You can see this in terms of the Vegas setting. The NCR despise him. The game, I think the game actually, again, does disservice to House in the fact that it refers to him in the ending slides if you end up killing him. The tyranny of House is broken. What tyranny effectively were we talking about? Tyranny in the sense that he was a despot or an autocrat, but again, he had no interest, again, operating other than maintaining this no harms libertarian principle. But the game decides to project this idea of tyranny onto him. What does exist is this idea of tyranny is very much inherent in terms of those people who feel they've come to Vegas and been dispossessed, who feel they can't come to the Strip and be able to challenge the power of the Securitrons. But also the feeling of the ruler and the ruled is very much palpable in the feeling of Benny and the feeling of the emertors. Benny's whole plan, of course, in Bugsy Siegel-esque fashion, is to try and take over the Strip from House. He has all the wealth, he has the power. It is simply a means of capturing it. And so there is a desire among the families who House has temporarily risen in order to depose him. The emertors even go so far as to call House not at home, in terms of the fact that he is simply an absentee ruler, and it is in fact the families who are getting their hands dirty in terms of running the empire, and therefore it is incumbent upon them to kill House and take over the Strip for themselves. In other words, if we're looking at this historically as an analogy, we can see that this is the mafia versus Howard Hughes, and you could say the civil government reenacting this conflict within the setting of the setting of New Vegas. So that is it for Vegas, as far as I'm concerned for now. And now here we come to the New California Republic. In the context of a post-apocalyptic setting, if people want me to talk about comparisons with Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, I can. But as it pertains to the lore of Fallout New Vegas, it is the greatest nation in existence. It possibly has the greatest army in all of existence. It's around 2281. It has a population of around 1 million people, which, considering this is a post-apocalyptic setting, is significant for a single government entity which is able to establish that sort of control, and thereby, with conscription, employ armies of tens, if not hundreds of thousands. But looking back at the backstory is very interesting. It was founded as a recreated American-style federal republic roughly 100 years before the setting of Vegas, New Vegas, becoming an established power by the time of Fallout 2. It began as a federation of 5 states in Southern California, made possible in part thanks to the original Vault Dweller, the hero of Fallout 1, who saved the second president of the Republic, Tandy, the daughter of the first president, Aradesh, the elder of Shady Sands. The original residents of Shady Sands originated from the vaults, Vault 15. The Vault 15 experiment was that of evaluating a community predicated around extreme racial and cultural diversity. Now, why I find this fascinating is that the Vault 15 experiment was basically the diversity, equity, and inclusion experiment. They included Rastafarians, Southern Baptist Christians, Indian Sikhs, etc., etc. However, after 20 years, the vault began to break down and the vault denizens began to leave, which again is very fortunate for them because many vault dwellers and many other vaults were denied the ability to leave by the overseers, even if that invariably meant that all of the vault dwellers would be killed and the overseer himself would be killed. Such was their dedication in terms of continuing on the experiment. But after the Great War, the inhabitants split into raider tribes, such as the Jackals, the Vipers, and the Great Khans, all of which we see in the Mojave Wasteland. And the result of the Voltic experiment left a distinct cultural impression on the Shady Sands residents. They were focused on the religious concept of Dharma, for example, not the Christian God, and they took the mutated two-headed bear as their symbol, and later that of the Republic, and called it the Brahman, obviously after the Hindu god. One would have thought that this could have led potentially to a more atypical political system vis-a-vis America, like that of the example of the Great Khans who deliberately modeled their society on the recreation of the Mongol Empire. However, instead, Aradesh was determined to amalgamate other prosperous communities in Southern California, such as the Hub, the Boneyard, and recreate the American Constitution with it, with a judiciary, a presidency, a senate, etc., the parity between the judicial, legislative, and executive branches. Though, how can we really explain this? I think it can be explained through the fact that one of the themes running through the NCR and paralleled, two-head cattle. Yes, thank you. Um, I'm doing most of this with notes and some off memory. So yes, Brahman's the two-headed cattle, and the bear is the symbol of the NCR. Sorry, thank you. Thank you for correcting me there. No, it's just the cow. Just the cow is the Brahman. Thank you, people in the chat, for correcting me there. So going back to my thematic through line, as we see that the Vault 15 experiment is basically the diversity, equity, and inclusion experiment, the parable is that of assimilation, cultural assimilation, and indeed cultural dominance. And as we saw that the federal constitution created for the creation of new territories and new states, it becomes analogous with the conquest of the American West. Albeit from the West Coast, it becomes a parable for the conquest of the American East. The American federal constitution, therefore, acts as a vehicle over a system which is, you can say, fundamentally atypical compared to the founding with the real United States of America. Tandy, Aradesh's daughter, was president for 52 years. So again, unlike the American federal constitution, there weren't term limits, or at least unofficial term limits up until Harry S. Truman. And Tandy was re-elected again and again and again. She didn't hold power like some sort of dictator. But nevertheless, I think it's fair to say in the grand scheme, if they're trying to make a commentary, Tandy was effectively like a beloved left-wing democratic despot. I think you can see it as a more benign version of someone like Hugo Chavez in terms of a left-wing, maybe even someone like a Peronist popular figure, Eva Peron or whatever, because it was focused very much on increased government regulation, equal rights, equal wealth, and land reform in such a way that actually restricted the number of Brahmin, which again is, in terms of access to food, is so important in terms of a post-apocalyptic setting. Restricting the access to Brahmin and land, therefore, acts as a major limitation in terms of wealth exploitation. So it's fair to say that the original Tandy California Republic is very much sort of indicative of some sort of pseudo-benevolent assimilationist sort of left-wing democracy. However, there is an attempt early on to create an economy which is distinct essentially from that of a salvaging economy based on the exchange of bottle caps being the main currency in the Fallout setting. And a representation of this would be moving to the gold standard. And this, of course, entailed resource expansion because the gold standard required a Federal Reserve, and the southern states did not have one. So they began the progress that you see, the theme explored throughout the Mojave, which is resource expansion. And this involved moving to the north and establishing connections with a town in the north called Redding. They also, on the way, the NCR encountered independent states, such as, in terms of a similar connection to the Emertas and the chairman in New Vegas, we have New Reno with the mob running there, and the isolationist Vault City. It is from here that we see the template from which the NCR will begin their expansion, their assimilation, and ultimately their conquest. They pursue a policy of divide and conquer, again, sort of imitating Caesar, divide et imperia, through attacking Vault City by cutting off their supply lines, paying irregulars, forming alliances with factions within New Reno. Basically, they pay off the bishop family of New Reno to form an alliance, and they become part of the establishment to wage this Cold War against the city of Vault City, which basically results in irregular warfare, banditry, etc., etc., and to the point that the city is pressured, forced into accepting annexation. You can see again this insidious form of conquest by stealth is something that the NCR is trying to repeat with using the squatters against the locals in somewhere like Freeside. And again, if the NCR annexes Freeside, they basically envelop the New Vegas Strip on all sides, preventing House really from asserting his plans to retain the independence, the free economic zone of New Vegas. All of these things you can bring in here. But why is this so significant? It's significant because Vault City was isolationist. It required people go through a heavy an examination and testing in order to get into the city. Indeed, ghouls and super mutants, ghouls are essentially are heavily irradiated people who, in terms of their lore implications, they're a question I'm not going to discuss here, but obviously they were discriminated against in the setting. And the basis again of the Vault City were they heavily isolationist and discriminated against these groups. In other words, they were anti-assimilationist. So the conquest of Vault City was a statement in terms of being able to counter anything which stood against the mantras of the NCR. It was basically this whole idea that democracy is totalitarian. It can brook nothing which stands in opposition to it. And so anti-immigration, isolationism was seen as antithetical to everything the NCR stood for. It goes from here to attack other remnants of the post-war or the pre-war government. It attacks the Enclave through the events of Fallout 2. First of all, by getting rid of their oil rig on the west coast and then attacking the remnant in Navarro. And then it begins a conflict with the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood of Steel, who had lived side by side with the NCR for most of its history. And indeed, Robert Maxson, the founder of the Brotherhood of Steel, was even given the honor of being named one of the states within the New Republic. But when Tandy dies, she is replaced by someone called Joanna Tippett. Joanna Tippett, you can say, pursues a gradualist policy towards expansion. And for that reason, she refuses to intervene in terms of expansion towards the Mojave, as all of the economic potential is beginning to be realized, especially in terms of the possibility of reactivating Hoover Dam, which has been basically untouched by the war. However, it is clear that there are factions within the NCR government who want to expand into the Mojave, regardless of whatever the executive faction feels. Conveniently, a group of 38 citizens go into the Mojave, which has now become a refuge for raider gangs that have been driven out by the NCR, and under mysterious circumstances they are found dead. Now you can possibly see this. This is a false flag or some sort of Mukden incident, but it later becomes the impetus and the pretext for an invasion, as we see the invasion of Manchuria. And I don't need to really get into the idea of the possible false flag, but again, a somewhat government-sponsored, disingenuous campaign to whip up public approval towards a very bellicose foreign policy, by Jingo, etc. So it seems interesting, isn't it, that neocon politics is actually playing out, and someone is mentioning Athenian democracy. Yes, someone is mentioning the whole idea of neocon politics, gradual expansionism, and pragmatism in foreign affairs, albeit with limitations when it comes to Vault City, versus massive and potential overexpansion. She is then ousted by someone called Wendell Peterson, who begins to establish a foothold in the Mojave. And this is when essentially the old populist left-wing system established by Tandy begins to unravel. There is a process of economic liberalization wealth concentration into figures popping up called Brahmin barons, who begin lobbying and basically buying senators. There is the abandonment of the gold standard, which causes massive inflation. And one of the reasons that the gold standard is abolished in the NCR is because, due to their overextension, and due to the fact they are fighting many wars at the same time now against the tribals in the Mojave or against the Brotherhood of Steel, the Brotherhood of Steel in the north are successfully preventing essentially the gold trade. And as a result of that, the gold reserves are basically split off. And as a result, they have to abandon the gold standard, and the currency effectively becomes worthless. And moreover, that is a prominent plot point within Fallout New Vegas itself. And indeed, the irony here is that Caesar's currency, Legion currency, is actually seen as more resistant to this form of hyperinflation. Again, someone is mentioning again the farce of fiat currency. But again, it's interesting in terms of the writing that we talk about assimilationism, democracy brooking no opposition, political corruption, economic liberalization, hyperinflation as per moving the gold standard, neoconservatism. All of these things are analogous to the system in the NCR. I think many people who are looking at this overly simply just see the NCR as good and Caesar as bad. But what the writers of the overall Fallout, the original writers, the Fallout series do, is actually present democracy, warts and all. And I think I can't credit them enough for actually having been able to achieve this. So when it gets to the actual events of the game, one General Kimball had effectively conquered the Mojave tribes, involving a brutal put down of the great Khans at Bitter Springs before being elected president. Though the NCR was now obliged to defend the Mojave because of the arrival of Caesar's Legion, and as a result of something called the Ranger Unification Treaty. The Mojave Rangers are basically allusions towards the Texas Rangers, and that provides the aesthetic for the NCR Rangers that you see within the game. Then we have the reactivation of Hoover Dam and the first victory against Caesar's Legion in 277. And that again provides the main impetus, the necessity for the NCR holding on to all of the strategic sites within the Mojave and providing the basis for annexation. Now, it's from this point that I want to come back to Hoppe and provide that distinction against the whole libertarian autocratic system, which had been there essentially to justify House's claim on the Mojave. In distinct contrast, the caretaker of a publicly owned government will try to maximize not total government wealth, but current income, regardless of expense. Even if the caretaker wishes to act differently, he cannot, because as public property governments are not for sale, and without market prices, economic calculation is impossible. Accordingly, it has to be regarded as unavoidable that public government ownership will result in continual capital consumption. Instead of maintaining or even enhancing the value of the government estate, as a private owner would tend to do, the government's temporary caretaker will quickly use up as much of the government resources as possible. For what he does not consume now, he may never be able to consume in the future. In particular, a caretaker, as distinct from a government's private owner, has no interest in not ruining his country. For why should he not want to increase his exploitation? If the advantage of a policy of moderation, the resulting higher capital value of government estate, cannot be reaped privately, why the advantage of opposite policy of increased exploitation, a higher current income, can be so reaped? To a caretaker, unlike to a private owner, moderation has only disadvantages and no advantages. Hence why you see wealth being squirreled away into the hands of the Brahmin barons, and hence why, when the government was effectively more monarchical, it pursued effectively a more populist left-wing course under Tandy. In addition, with a publicly owned government, anyone in principle can become a member of the ruling class, or even the supreme power. The distinction between the rulers and the ruled, as well as class consciousness of the land, become blurred. The illusion even arises that distinction no longer exists, that with a public government, no one is ruled by anyone, but everyone instead rules himself. Again, that's the mantra of the NCR effectively being a bona fide democracy. Accordingly, public resistance against government power is weakened. While exploitation and expropriation might have appeared plainly oppressive and evil in the public, they may seem less so, mankind being what it is, once anyone can be freely enter the ranks of those who are at the receiving end. Consequently, not only will exploitation increase, whether openly in the form of higher taxes, again, that's a recurring theme within the story of New Vegas. So, for example, when you want to annex a town to Vegas, say, for example, Prim, the precursor here is that you have to basically pay taxes. In order to get protection, you have to join in, you have to financially contribute to the coffers. And this, of course, is increasing. That's commented on a lot by many characters within the game, that as the government is expanding, as it's reaping a policy of short-termism and having to be massively extended on so many fronts, that everyone is basically facing the burden of taxes. And indeed, the extension of this, if we're going to form some sort of 60s analogy, you can almost look at the Mojave as a Vietnam. And in that sense, we see greater conscription, greater numbers for ultimately nebulous purposes if we look in the long term. If one can't secure Hoover Dam, effectively the whole thing is pointless. And it doesn't seem to be even capable of securing Hoover Dam, given all the powers that are at work to undermine the NCR. Increased government money creation, inflation, or legislative regulation. Likewise, the number of government employees, public servants, will rise absolutely, as well as relatively to private employment, in particular attracting and promoting individuals with high degree of time preference and low and limited farsightedness. It's actually interesting. There are a huge number of public servants within the NCR that one meets. Of course, this is a principle effectively of it being a military occupation zone. But beyond the NCR, you have the OSI, the operation of Science Institute, or something like that. I can't really quite remember the name. Operated by a doctor who sends you off basically on a suicide mission to find the secrets of Vault 22 for the sake of growing more crops. Part of the problem with this exploitation and massive overexpansion is that the time hasn't been taken effectively to invest in infrastructure. Infrastructure in terms of water provisions, infrastructure in terms of the roads, infrastructure in terms of farming. All of these things are in incredibly precarious state as a result of this sense of limited farsightedness, and it's something that many characters comment on, and it's something that many characters essentially hope to redress. However, there's also another element here in terms of the monopoly, essentially the government totalizing all aspects of people's lives, is that even quote unquote private enterprises within the NCR, like the Crimson Caravan Company, are also heavily embedded and entrenched in the government, as we see also with the Brahmin barons. So there are many private individuals who are reaping the profits and exploiting the managerial state effectively for their own ends. So there are two summaries I can sort of draw from this in order to ultimately get to, you can say, more specific elements of this, and it's Caesar's commentary on the NCR. And quoting him, "As a young man, I was taught to venerate President Tandy of Shady Sands, the founding mother of the new California Republic. Did you know her presidency lasted 52 years, and that her father, Aradesh, was the Republic's first president? Does that sound like democracy to you, or a hereditary dictatorship? Ever since losing its queen, the NCR has been weaker, more diffuse. Democracy has been its weakness, not its strength. Greed runs rampant. The government is corrupt, accepting bribes from Brahmin barons and landowners to the detriment of citizens. The NCR is a loose conglomerate of individuals looking out for themselves, hence again the short-termism of what Hoppe refers to as caretakerism. It's lost virtue. No one cares about the collective, the greater good. It's not built to last." And Caesar again would mention, "I'm simply there to hasten the inevitable." And then here comes the perspective from someone who is actually a citizen of the NCR. I'm not some blind, this is a Cass of Cassidy Caravan. She's one of the followers you can pick up. I'm not some blind, flag saluting, do as they will NCR lover. They're family. But let me tell you what family means. You ever have a brother, some dumbass younger brother, say who knocked up the pastor's daughter, can't hold a job, and is home away from home as a jail cell? That is the NCR. Their compass is spinning all the time. Again, I find it funny how Hopper is such a sort of close analogy to this assessment, which is actually coming from the mouthpiece of the characters in the games. And this is also a greater sort of point on video games themselves as a genre. When it comes to film, and indeed when it actually comes to books, you have to operate within a strict narrative structure in order for the whole thing to make sense. Sometimes you deviate from these sort of structures, but on the whole, you have to maintain all the facets sort of being relevant to the plot. And the wonderful thing about Vegas in particular as an RPG, and more freeform RPGs, is that it allows you to take time away from the central plot in order to explore the perspectives of new characters and examine their stories. Um, and again, it's more licensed than even a TV show would grant. So, say Cass. Cass has no bearing on the wider story of Vegas really at all. But her commentary is invaluable in terms of understanding the limitations of the NCR and how she, as a citizen, can reconcile to that, despite the fact that she feels disempowered by the whole system. And yet she feels, again, family. She feels some ownership, some possessiveness of the system, because her story is a tragedy. She is there at the main outpost, linking the Mojave with the NCR. That in itself is basically disastrous because she will basically illustrate that her caravan has been attacked. It's been destroyed. Many other caravans have been attacked. Many of her competitors or even her colleagues have also been attacked. And this is because the government cannot control the supply lines. It's something which is opened up in Honest Hearts when we talk about Caesar cutting the supply line with New Canaan, which is basically a metaphor for Salt Lake City, and cutting the supply line in the divide. Caesar is adopting a Fabian strategy in parts by cutting off the supply routes. And the one supply route that the NCR has left with the Mojave outpost, is basically cut off from New Vegas. There is a route going north, which is guarded by these irradiated monsters called Deathclaws. And that again is remarkable because that's another route that's been cut off and no one is doing anything about it. Indeed, maybe this is actually a detriment to New Vegas's writing in part because I still think it's very unlikely that this should be the case. But nevertheless, it is one point. If you go on the road down from the Mojave outpost into the intersection which cuts off to Primm and Nipton, the two routes effectively linking the NCR with Las Vegas, it still has tons and tons of cars there which haven't been scrapped for parts or whatever from the Great War. And indeed, caravanners still walk around using Brahman, essentially, pack Brahman to move goods around. In terms of the actual technology being invested in the NCR, it is not being invested in terms of being able to develop, trucks, lorries, and cars, even though you do see a couple which aren't being used within the game. Of course, one has to talk about this as a limitation of gameplay and say that they can't. Bethesda engines don't seem to be able to introduce vehicles very well. Someone has been able to create a mod which has introduced something like that into New Vegas, but nevertheless, if we're talking about a world building point of view, that is a major detriment to the NCR. And part of her story involves having to deal with the fact that a collaboration of a mob, the Van Graffs, and the Crimson Caravan, who are so deeply embedded in the NCR, are there basically to create a monopoly and destroy competitors. And the only response to it basically is to file a report which goes back and may at one point be hit by the Senate. So it's remarkable in the sense that the process is basically explained like that. There is no sugarcoating what the NCR represents. But there are other aspects you can talk about the NCR. So, for example, it is clearly, as I've already mentioned, an analogy for the conquest of the American West. It's cowboys and Indians. The Mojave Rangers, the NCR Rangers, the cowboys, and the Great Khans and ultimately Caesar's Legion of the Indians. It is a tale of overextension, of democratic politics, of conscription, and of course of the elimination of political opposition. I mentioned the experience of Vault City. I've mentioned the super mutants, the ghouls, the relationship between the NCR and how that varied over time. I talk about the Great Khans. The Great Khans were one of the great adversaries right from the time of Tandy and Aradesh, but the Great Khans have been constantly on the retreat. And then you have the Bitter Springs massacre, which it's difficult again to say who has the sort of clearest assumption of that, but One of the perpetrators of the Bitter Springs massacre, a former NCR member of First Recon, Boone, who again can be one of your followers, is so traumatized by the experience, he suffers from PTSD, that he basically wishes for death. He has a death wish, and he attempts to recreate that experience in order basically to take as many legionaries with him as possible. And again, he's also doom driven in the sense that he's trying to get revenge for the death of his wife, but what have you. The experience of NCR troopers going after the tribals and basically waging this war about all is having that sort of effect on its own citizens. And of course, the war isn't won. The Khans are still that enclave which exists in Red Rock Canyon, and can potentially ally with Caesar's Legion. And then you get to the enclave. It's interesting that one of the themes regarding the enclave is that it wasn't just enough to defeat the enclave. One had to prescribe and send bounty hunters to kill any relatives of the enclave and basically issue a form of neo-McCarthyism in terms of eradicating anyone with relations again with the enclave. So all of this again is just to indicate that the NCR is so bent on assimilation and expansion to its own detriment. I mean, if people want me to talk more specifically, there are obviously good characters in the NCR. One could talk about Colonel Shu, one can talk about Ambassador Crocker, what have you. There are corrupt figures such as many sort of what's his name, Sergeant Contreras. Many characters who are basically exploiting the NCR system in order to become drug dealers, etc. Corrupt workers such as the miners at Sloan. Many, many, many more examples. And then you have someone like Colonel Moore, who is your primary quest giver as part of the NCR storyline, who has basically lost all connection with humanity. She is so concerned with results that her first response basically is to eliminate all political opposition, even if that would have long-term detriments to the actual policies of the NCR, which basically involve a full-scale eradication of the group the Kings that I mentioned in Freeside. So where does this really affect and limit the effectiveness of the NCR? Well, I've mentioned the case in Freeside. It should also be mentioned that the NCR basically ignore the other element, which is West Side, because again, West Side does not have the connection as a potential route that Freeside is into the Strip area. And so it's obvious at one point that the NCR will try to annex that region, but effectively they don't care for now. Then you come to Vegas itself. Vegas is the main target for annexation outside of Hoover Dam and securing that zone. However, House has such a good grasp of what the NCR represents that many of the characters comment, especially Crocker, that we come over here with the intention to annex New Vegas, and in many senses, they have annexed us. And the reason that is the case is because the NCR fails to make inroads with the various families because of their lucrative dealings with House, effectively. And even if they wanted to ally with the NCR or outside factions, effectively, these are for their own benefit, and they are ultimately undermined by the Courier. Because House has a monopoly of violence on the Strip, it limits the family's ability to really subvert him. And again, if you look at Benny's attempts to basically get into the Lucky 38 by creating a tunnel going in the wrong direction, they really are farcical in many ways. And I hate to say this, but again, one of the limitations of Fallout is that the Courier is basically given an open door to many places which he or she shouldn't have access to. The most egregious example is basically being allowed into the Lucky 38 irrespective of the player's allegiance to House, in the same sense that the player is basically allowed to go to Fortification Hill and either enable or destroy the Securiton army without Caesar's knowledge. Basically, there's an in-law explanation as to why that happens, but many things are given to the player in order for the story to happen. But I believe, again, with more development time, this could be made slightly more realistic. But when it comes to the whole, again, House thing, House is there not to fight the NCR. House is there to exploit the NCR. House looks at the NCR and his responses. This is a society that craves luxury and security. It is a society of customers. They will be the engine for my growing economy. So long as I can basically control the infrastructure and I can provide the allure, the tourism for which to come to Vegas, and now I can monopolize the use of water and the use of electricity from Hoover Dam, they have no recourse with the creation of my Securitron army other than simply to bow to my whims, effectively. So House is in a position that, unlike Vault City, he can effectively take all the weaknesses of the NCR and take them and turn them to his advantage. And there's one thing I should mention coming onto the factions, which I'll be loathed if I didn't mention them. One is the Powder Gangers. Because of the limitations of, again, the NCR and their ability to actually enforce law and basic preservation of infrastructure like roads, there has been a breakout at one of the prison centers. And convenient enough, they were there to clear quarries, and they were given dynamite. And what do? They they caused a prison riot, and then used those resources to kill off all NCR prospectors, citizens, and anyone who attempted to take back the prison. So the NCR were the authors of their own demise when it comes to powder gangers. But again, they have no resources to actively deal with it. They need the active involvement of the player in order to get rid of the powder ganger faction, which is, again, why the courier is so important in terms of being the wild card in all of these considerations. So again, that is a testament to the failure of the NCR. But then there is another element, which is probably more extreme, which are the fiends. The Great Khans are able to wage an indirect war of retaliation for the massacre of Bitter Springs on the NCR by turning themselves into drug dealers, drug manufacturers and drug dealers, and giving them to an organization known as the Fiends, an entire tribal army supported by Caesar's Legion, which is hopped up on drugs. And the reason is they can basically form human waves of attackers to launch nearly suicidal attacks against the main NCR installation at Camp McCarran. And because of this, the NCR are basically facing an existential threat at Hoover Dam when it comes to Caesar's Legion, and they're facing a major threat when it comes to their own headquarters and doorstep being prosecuted by the Fiends. The NCR cannot deal with both threats directly, and so Caesar is basically able to utilize all of these elements of discontent, not so much the powder gangers, but very much when it comes to the Fiends, to undermine the NCR's hold over the Mojave. So the analogy towards again, the vulnerabilities, the deficiencies of neocon foreign policy, and how short-sighted and how aggressive foreign policy without long-term considerations or a process of consolidation can lead to a situation like the crisis that the NCR faces in the Mojave, despite having nominally annexed it. So that's what I'm going to say about the NCR for now. I think I've done that quite extensively. So when it comes to honorable mentions for some of the factions, which I can't really tie in historically, as I mentioned, the Boomers were Vault 34 or Vault 35, I can't quite remember, a Vaultic experiment. Large firearms being provided to a large population and a tiny living space. A group of them left, and they took many of their weapons with them, vast amounts of military ordnance and explosives. They took over a pre-war military base, Nellis Air Base, and they became a xenophobic, trigger-happy enclave, effectively. You can almost say that they are the modern Vault City, in terms of also their origins from a vault. They're the closest thing. But because of the overextension of the NCR and their location, which is in the far extreme of the map in the northeast, they are not the same target for expansion of the NCR, but nevertheless, the NCR realize that they need to get their hands on the ordnance, and so will target the player in terms of being able to either eliminate that faction or being able to turn that faction to become an ally of the NCR, which again was the desired route when it came to the original Vault City. But I also have to mention that the Boomers as a name in terms of the whole atomic reference is again playful. It not only indicates the fact that they are trigger happy and high on explosives, but they are also a reference to the baby boomer generation. I mentioned the Van Graffs and the Crimson Caravan. The Van Graffs are interesting in the sense that they would have played a prominent part in the Van Buren game that was cancelled, the original sort of vision of Fallout 3 from Sawyer and Avalone. The Van Graafs, as it so happened, were able to take vast amounts of energy weapons from the fall of the Enclave and establish themselves as energy weapons sales merchants and a major criminal gang. If you listen to Gloria Van Graaf, her intention, basically, mission statement, is to eliminate all opposition. And this is focused on people like Cassidy and Sharon Cassidy Caravans. It's also focused on organizations like the Gun Runners. But she is also intelligent enough to understand that she will temporarily ally with the NCR if it means, say, for example, fighting off a greater threat, such as Caesar's Legion. But nevertheless, the Van Graafs are very much concerned with the expansion of the NCR. They want to maintain their independence and influence, and yet they are cognizant of the fact that they will dwindle in significance compared to the growth of the NCR. So like House, their long-term plan, intention, is to ensure that the NCR doesn't become so powerful it overwhelms them. And as we see with Alice McClafferty with the Crimson Caravan, the Mojave is basically an outpost from which to extend their influence and again circumvent NCR control. Now we come to the Enclave. The plot of Fallout 2, if I remember correctly, was to use a Vault population to experiment with the use of an airborne FEV virus, which had killed off the surface dweller population who had been exposed to mutations and radiation. This is circumvented through the destruction of the oil rig and later Navarro, and later this is used to give blanket writs against Enclave members, including family members. And that's where you're introduced to Arcade Gannon. Arcade Gannon is a conduit to the followers of the Apocalypse and the Enclave. He is one of the followers you can join, and also he's distinctive for many reasons. He's distinctive for his absolute loathing of Caesar's Legion, despite the fact he is very well versed in classical literature. And by classical literature, I mean actual classics. He speaks at least rudimentary Latin and is able to quote various examples back to you. So he is presented to the player as a very intelligent character. In a sense, I would say his intelligence is demonstrated when he's able basically to take stock of his opinions whenever he may be wrong. If I'm going to sort of explain intelligence that way, if the player character can actually act as a parity when it comes to their intelligence. But he is less noteworthy in terms of him being a introduction to the followers of the Apocalypse than he is a introduction to the Enclave faction. He deals with the fact that his father was a member of the Enclave, but is able to present it in such a light where he considers his father was honorable. And when you meet Enclave characters, again, they don't seem to be so dissimilar from the NCR. There's only one character within the Enclave remnants that you meet, Oren Moreno, who is seen as completely sort of die-hard, rah-rah Enclave, anti-NCR. But the rest of them seem to be pragmatic, amenable, and again, not so different from the NCR. So again, if that's a commentary, it is also a commentary in the fact that the NCR's anti-Enclave campaign seems to be somewhat misplaced. It also demonstrates that, at least as far as the West Coast is concerned, that the Enclave is really nothing more than a viable expansion. The only potential expansion and continuation of the Enclave would be through Arcade Gannon, and it's very much clear due to his own interpretation, his horror, and his own designation of the Enclave as a fascistic organization and his terror directed towards iBots would indicate that he has no intention of carrying on the legacy of the Enclave. So it's pretty much a dead end. Like I said, if people want me to talk about Fallout 3, they can ask me in the questions at the end. But now I want to come to the figure of Father Elijah. I didn't know where to include this sector in the presentation because Father Elijah I'm going to compare with Caesar, Joshua Graham, and Ulysses. But we go from the Enclave and their advanced technology and their desire to use FEV to kill off the population because of their genetic impurities. And Father Elijah is in many ways held in contradistinction to the rest of the Brotherhood of Steel. Because if I'm going to look at the Brotherhood of Steel, I mean, it's a mainstay in the series. I mean, it was even around in a game precursor to Fallout 1 in a game precursor to Fallout 1 in the game Wasteland, where they were portrayed as xenophobic monks. And there was also a 1959 book in a book called A Canticle for Leibowitz, which featured a post-apocalyptic Catholic monastery, which was an analogy for the fall of the Roman Empire. I mean, clearly, you have Catholic monks hoarding onto knowledge, keeping it for future generations. It's obvious that the Brotherhood of Steel have elements, like the followers of the Apocalypse, of a analogy towards monasteries during the Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire, which is more appropriate considering Caesar wants to recreate the Roman Empire within the setting that we consider the historical implications of the Brotherhood of Steel. So it is clear there are a melding of science fiction, medieval inspiration. At one point, House even refers to them as knights of yore, albeit that's a rather obscure reference, but something that perhaps would be grounded within science fiction at the time. It began Robert Maxon. Like I said, there was an ode to the NCR and the fact that the state was created after him, but the Brotherhood never became part of the NCR. And in many ways, the Brotherhood were indirectly responsible for the NCR's presence in the Mojave, because a chapter leader, Father Elijah, was sent west to reactivate the Hoover Dam. Instead, he ignored the Hoover Dam and began concentrating on Helios 1, which drew the NCR as part of their longer conflict with the Brotherhood to attack them, outnumber them massively at Helios 1, and ultimately send Father Elijah into seclusion. But there are many elements. On the one hand, you can say they represent modern knights in shining armor, almost literally, in the sense that one could look at the power armor of their paladins, which is a technological legacy brought over from the Anchorage campaign during the Great War. And their whole mission, again, is on hoarding technology. One can claim it's saving technology from those who would misuse it. Others would claim that basically they're hoarding technology. They, again, like Vault City, like the Boomers, have very xenophobic policies in the sense that you can't really join the Brotherhood. The courier joining the Brotherhood is really exceptional. You really have to be born into the Brotherhood, and it's very much expected that you have children in order to continue the race of people effectively who have founded the Brotherhood under Maxim. But it's as part of that mantra that they were there and they were responsible for helping the Vault Dweller defeat the Master. However, by the time of Fallout New Vegas, they very much have a complicated morality. And this is where it's interesting to talk about the character Veronica later, because she very much provides a deconstruction. But going back to Father Elijah. So there's the premise that the Brotherhood of Steel is there to preserve technology to prevent it being misused. It is there effectively to hold on to a legacy of the old world, to prevent knowledge being misused, and effectively to keep the fire civilization alive. Albeit it's clear that the followers of the Apocalypse, which Arcade is a member of, do not have a military component to it, but they are essentially carrying that mission far more successfully, and they are deliberately spreading the knowledge in the same way that Catholic missionaries would enter the courts of tribes, of tribal rulers, and ultimately Charlemagne, who was semi-illiterate. But it's through Catholic monks that spurred on the quote-unquote Carolingian Renaissance, if you can refer to that. But Father Elijah takes that codex, the Brotherhood Codex, and John Gordon, if you didn't know anything about Fallout New, I mean, it is a review of Fallout New Vegas, a historical review of Fallout New Vegas. I assume, either you're interested in the period, or interested in the themes, or hopefully you've played it in order to understand what I'm talking about. But nevertheless, all of these characters are pertinent because they're ways which I can exposit and understand themes which they represent. Taking Father Elijah. The Brotherhood of Steel, like I said, is there to preserve technology, but Father Elijah is there to expand the use of technology for its own sake. At Helios 1, there is a satellite weapon, which is called the Euclid Sea Finder, which turns out actually to be a damp squib in the grand scheme of things. But that is why Father Elijah is so obsessed with holding on to this solar power plant, because he believes it's access to the Archimedes system, which is a great weapon, which turns out to be the Euclid Sea Finder. It's basically the same thing that we see with the orbital device that the Enclave have in Fallout 3, which becomes the premise for the Brotherhood, the Broken Steel expansion pack. But there are many aspects to him. On the one hand, there is something I really wanted to mention here in the stream, but I can't because of YouTube censorship policies. But I was going to mention Uncle Ted and his criticism of industrial society, but I can't. But nevertheless, it should be obvious to people who are familiar with that in so many ways, Fallout is a critique of that whole premise. And indeed, there are little elements where Father Elijah is also representing a critique of that premise, because at one point during the Dead Money DLC, where he's ultimately the antagonist, he argues that the Pip-Boy is a convenience, as a crutch as it was in the old world. And again, one has to wonder, is this whole, again, an argument simultaneously that, like Caesar's legion, we need to form an army of sinew and bone, and we shouldn't be so dependent on technology. But like I said, this seems to be somewhat inconsistent with his character, because his whole character is obsessed in terms of the expansion of technology. And just to quote him, during the events of the Dead Money DLC, you are drawn into this dead casino, which was built essentially by a hopeless romantic called Sinclair for his ultimately unfaithful love, Vera Keyes. But he was also a brilliant scientist, and he used the Sierra Madre as basically a weapons and technology catch. And because of that, there are some bizarre experiments going on, and the use of incredible sort of futuristic technologies such as hologram vendors and security systems, which are basically impervious to be damaged, which is also linked in with the Los Alamos style big empty old world blues experiments. There are many deliberate connections there. But Father Elijah comes to this casino fortress, this dead city, and he wants to use it as a tool for conquest, in the same way very much that the Enclave were looking for technology as a tool for conquest, in the same way that Caesar would represent really that antithesis, but it's still basically the same idea: to wipe the slate clean, to begin again, to undo that old world civilization. Why the NCR is so egregious to all these people is, like I said, it represents all of the failings of democracy up until the Great War. One has to basically eliminate it and start with something new. As Caesar acts basically a criticism of that, and so Ulysses acts as a criticism of that, Father Elijah fits into this whole scheme. And just to quote him, "The cloud allows me to wipe the slate clean. Collars ensure cooperation. Holograms defense. Vending machines provide everything else. Collars are slave collars. They put you around, and basically if you disobey or try to escape, your head blows up. Vending machines basically are able to create anything out of pure energy." So again, it's almost like the replicators that you see in Star Trek. "The Sierra Madre can kill nations and build them. Using technology with the right applications, I'll scour Hoover Dam with the cloud, rain its walls with spears from the sun. With an army of old world ghosts behind me, I'll kill them until it's only me alone in a quiet world." Again, you can sort of see a bit of Howard Hughes in here in terms of the reclusive nature and the excessive use of pioneering technology. There are basically odes towards House and Elijah, albeit Elijah is basically a vehicle for destruction and damnation, whereas Howard Hughes versus Robert House conceives of himself basically as a visionary in opposition to Father Elijah. Indeed, there is actually an option within the game to side with Elijah, at which point the game simply ends, but you're told by an ending slide that you went off and basically genocided the population using the cloud, using the holographic technology. But like I said, how is that really any different from Ulysses' plan during another expansion in Lonesome Road, which is basically just to nuke the NCR or to nuke Caesar's Legion or whatever? The idea basically of beginning again is told to the player over and over and over again within that DLC. And it seems that Father Elijah is taking that to its most literal implication, understanding all of the effects that technology can be used to harness for his own sake. Against that genocidal vision of technology, which is antithetical to everything that the Brotherhood is supposed to represent, we have Veronica. Veronica understands that the Brotherhood is failing. The Brotherhood population will die out. And she wants the Brotherhood, again, this is something actually explored in the previous Fallout games, but she wants the Brotherhood to perform a function which is useful to the outside world, not simply in opposition to it, and also to ensure its long-term survival. And she essentially wants the Brotherhood to pursue a role similar to that of the Followers of the Apocalypse, albeit with significantly more knowledge and also the ability to defend themselves, which the Followers cannot. And despite all of this, she is shut down. and she is sidelined by the leadership, either by the hardline Brotherhood of Steel leader Harden, who you can put in power, or the original leader. Oh God, I've forgotten his name now. Sorry, forgive me. Someone in the chat will know. But anyway, in either way, the Brotherhood basically has opted for destruction in both sense. Sorry, Father and McNamara. Yeah, that's the one. And to be honest, I think in many ways, even though Veronica is looking to that, that's not to say that the Brotherhood of Steel isn't completely blind to the opportunities afforded with interaction with the outside world. So again, this is a bit of inconsistent storytelling, so to speak. But Father Elder McNamara is intelligent enough to realize that as part of the ongoing Brotherhood of Steel NCR war, that the NCR are so overextended and the Brotherhood was so damaged after Helios 1 that this is actually in a means and environment for which the Brotherhood of Steel can recover. And he posits the idea, effectively with the player's help, that the Brotherhood of Steel can begin to assume that role of defending the roads, which the NCR basically failed to do, and forming a short-term alliance, allowing for the Brotherhood of Steel to recover. So assuming that is the outcome if you pursue the NCR route, or you basically screw up the Yes Man route, it is possible, therefore, that some aspect of Veronica's vision of a reformed Brotherhood of Steel, a la what we see in the previous iteration of the games, can finally come about. But it shouldn't come as a surprise that House, as he's antithetical to Father Elijah, is completely antithetical to the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood of Steel are there to confiscate advanced technology, and the whole premise of House's plan is built around the use of advanced technology, and so it is incumbent on him to destroy it. But now we come to the faction that I'm sure most of you are wanting me to talk about the most, which is Caesar's Legion. Basically, Caesar's Legion, Mad Max, Road Warrior inspired slavers combined 86 tribes wearing NFL uniforms. If you imagine Apocalypse Now, if you imagine Mojave as Vietnam with conscription, instead imagine instead of Marlon Brando as Colonel Kurtz in Cambodia, see John Doman as Caesar. Again, if I'm going to sort of take quotes from history and take quotes from Ulysses, the whole faction took it from a book, found it in a book, took it from history, found it in the book. It's an old world name, basically a analogy for what Caesar's Legion did. And again, he echoes this when to quote Caesar. If there's anything I learned as Edward Sallow, a follower of the apocalypse, there's a lot of good information found in old books. So where does this character come from? Caesar was originally a citizen of the NCR, as I mentioned, called Edward Sallow. He went off with a follower of the apocalypse called Calhoun and met up with a Mormon missionary called Joshua Graham. And they were there essentially to do what Caesar, in hindsight, would basically say is completely useless, and if you could justify it, is an idiot, which is to learn backward dialects of the various tribes that have been forming around in the post-apocalypse. Because, as Caesar himself mentioned, what the atomic bomb did was basically set civilization back to ground zero. And that is very much informed by his belief that we had progressed to barbarism and tribalism. So, given his knowledge, and obviously given the fact that he is a genius, he encountered a tribe known as the Blackfoots. And part of his life experience is very much intended by the developers to imitate that of the real Caesar. Or, conversely, one can say because Edward Sallow's life in some respects mirrored that of the Caesar, the original Julius Caesar, that he decides to take it as an inspiration. So it's either the developers deciding to use that to justify the character, or Caesar post hoc sees these analogies and uses that to inspire his own conception, self-conception of Caesar, because he is taken hostage by the Blackfoots in the same way that Julius Caesar was taken hostage by pirates and then demanded a higher ransom, promised he would go off and kill the pirates later, and of course he did. But in the case of Caesar, Caesar looks at the pitiful state of the tribes and uses his knowledge as a follower of the apocalypse, again, as an anti-Arcade. If you're going to look at someone like Arcade Gannon as a follower and sort of understand his story, perhaps he sees himself as a mirror to Caesar. He sees himself what advanced technology, indeed what enclave technology, he probably has access to more technology and information than Caesar ever did. What sort of thing he could have achieved had he decided to pursue Caesar's path. But this one man armed with an arsenal of books, in particular Edward Gibbon and the commentaries of the Gallic Wars by Caesar, he goes off and he's able to assume the command of a tribe. Because that tribe is so backward that they look to Caesar for their expertise, and not only his ability in terms of his leadership abilities, his logistical capacity, but also his knowledge of how to basically create weapons. From there, we begin the process of conquering other tribes, waging what he considers to be total warfare versus low intensity conflict, which would take the form of pillaging and looting. And he is able to amalgamate these tribes into something which he basically calls the Legion, appointing himself to be Caesar. And that begins the process of assimilation from which he forms the empire of slavers based on the 86 tribes. And this is how Caesar himself refers to his own construct. Rome was a highly militarized autocracy that effectively integrated the foreign cultures it conquered. It dedicated its citizens to something higher than themselves, the idea of Rome. In Rome, I found a template for a society equal to the challenges of the post-apocalyptic world, a society that could and would survive, a society that could prevent mankind from fracturing and destroying itself in this new world by establishing a new Pax Romana. Pax Romana means a nationalist, imperialist, totalitarian, homogenous culture that obliterates the identity of every other group it conquers. Long-term stability at all costs. The individual has no value beyond his utility to the state, whether as an instrument of war or of production. Now, obviously, there are many sort of things you can draw in terms of the sort of influence from that. But again, the modern appellations of nationalist and totalitarian, homogenous, this again, it would seem, again, it's a deliberate template. It's a deliberate template formed on a military society and not the actual Roman civilization. And as someone rather perceptively has mentioned in the chat, it's basically taking the federati, taking the auxiliaries and tribal allies of Rome, and turning it on its head and making that Rome in and of itself. And it's obvious. It's so obvious that there is a sign to authenticity within this historical reenactment. Even though they wear NFL uniforms, it's very much based on the red of conquest, the red of power, the color which is painted onto the faces of those receiving a Roman triumph. There is the attention to detail whereby the legionaries assume the ranks of the old Roman legion. They employ similar rituals like that of decamatio, which is expounded upon in depth within the game. They employ many of the same sort of tactics, such as using the frumentari as agents effectively of sabotage. And based around that, you also have little idiosyncrasies like the use of proper classical Roman pronunciation. So it is clear that Caesar designed it to be as authentically Roman as it could be, and yet he is fully aware of how alien the society is, how anachronistic it is, how postmodern it is. It is basically an entire empire derived out of text, if we're going to look at textual analysis of this. He's taken all of these disparate tribes, he has obliterated their identity, and he has superimposed this alien society because he believes it's a parable from the past that could be used to deal with essentially a dark world. It is basically a civilization looking at the cultures that Europe was inhabited by the time of the 3rd century BC and believing that Rome would be the example. But like I said, it is effectively gloss over a tribal amalgamation, which is there essentially to drive an economy based on slaves. There may be a legion, but there is no Rome. There is no Roman Senate. There is no Roman culture. There is no real Roman economy, even though, as you can mention on this map, they have cities. They mention something like the advanced infrastructure. They have their capital at Flagstaff. It is very much a military society based on the continued use of terror, unlike the Republican vestiges and the high degrees of ethnocentrism, the politically heterogeneous, diffuse Republican institutions, and indeed what Julius Caesar represents as a general, he did not represent as a politician. Being a dictator is not necessarily what Caesar necessarily assumes it to be. And when he considers Rome, ironically, he superimposes Rome onto things which are completely antithetical to everything Rome was, either to make the Colorado the Rubicon, to make Las Vegas his Rome, or to see the new California Republic as representing the old Roman institutions. In other words, it's purely a parable. It's a parable with all of these loose associations drawn from history, which taken together don't actually make any sense in terms of a literal recreation of Roman history. But that's not to say, but that's also to say that this actually works to the advantage of the whole makeup of Caesar's Legion and what it represents. There are little things I'm going to mention, like the fort, for example. The fort can very much be, say, for example, indicative of the real-life Battle of Alesia, which was the center point of the campaign against Vercingetorix. You can say that the first Battle of Hoover Dam was a equivalent of the Battle of Gergovia, which was the great loss that Caesar suffered at the hands of Vercingetorix. But again, the irony is actually that it is Vercingetorix who has a closer a closer sort of parable to the fictional Caesar in this case, because it was Vercingetorix who took the distinct tribes of Gaul and united them in opposition to Roman conquest within this consideration. So it's interesting how, in terms of the tribes, in terms of the federati, there was much of Vercingetorix that you see within Caesar as opposed to the historical Caesar. It should also be noticed that there are many comparisons that one can draw with the NCR, despite the fact that Caesar identifies the empire within total contradistinction, such as the idea that it is brutally assimilationist and it is homogenist, it is imperialist, like the NCR describes itself. It is also engaging in overextension, massive expansion, as we see with Caesar himself in his campaigns in Gaul. Caesar built the first bridge over the River Rhine, which ultimately served very little purpose. He went off and tried to conquer Britain. Again, didn't really secure it very well and had to retreat. And it took a great successor in the form of Augustus Caesar to consolidate the gains made by Julius Caesar. And that is another thing which very much impacts the whole assessment of the Legion, is that Caesar himself is very frail. Part of the Caesar storyline is focused on his own mortality. He suffers from a brain tumor, and the character can either assassinate him, fail to cure him, or potentially heal him. And he's going to be replaced by someone who is basically the total antithesis of an Augustus Caesar, someone who is basically just a pure warlord, or at least presented that way. The issue, however, is that we don't really understand his characterization very well, because towards the end of the game, you can talk him down by appealing to the logic of logistics. So there may be an angle with which you can take Lennius, who is the successor of Caesar, and draw a distinction between the monster of the East, who is characterized as the potential successor and the ultimate warlord of Julius Caesar, and say that he's actually more intelligent than his reputation would essentially entail. But that would not be congruous with what we see from characters such as the leading frumentari of Caesar, Vulpes Inculta, who essentially believes that the Caesar's Legion is finished under the legate, in the same way that Joshua Graham also mimics that sentiment. To quote him, "The Legion dies with Caesar. What follows now are the last steps of a man who does not yet realize he's walking dead." So in terms of other inspirations one can draw, again, I'm trying to bring this back to the setting, and there is one disparate connection I brought out, which is going back to Richard Nixon and talk about Nixon's war on drugs, and going back to the Uncle Ted comparison, and the fact that it is explicitly the Legion focused on drawing out a civilization which isn't predicated on what Father Elijah was mentioning, which is convenience, use of the Pip-Boy. It is anti-technology. It is civilization of flesh, sinew, and bone, mortal stuff. It is, again, like I said, in the same way that Roman Empire innovated in this sense, you can say Caesar is directly counteracting that element that Rome is to be a civilizational force in the conventional sense. Rather, Rome is to be a civilizational force in the sense that he is creating a military force that can suffer all the privations and won't be susceptible to the same corruption as we see with what they refer to as the profligates in the NCR. And the one comparison I bring to Nixon is the war on drugs, effectively, which is depicted in Fear and Loathing. If we're going to draw that and basically say that the war on drugs is some sort of grander analogy towards Caesar's Legion. So I've already mentioned the fact that the whole construct is taken out of a book. It is postmodern in the sense that this is a world derived from an interpretation of text, albeit Caesar understands effectively that it is a template. It is a template for something which is completely homogeneous, which is based on something which is as distinct as the federati who make it up. In other words, it comes from something which is distinctly anti-Roman, and yet it tries to present itself as representing this Roman authenticity despite its totalitarian homogeneity, which Roman civilization never was, effectively. I mentioned the idea that so much of New Vegas is built around the mythos of the courier and the great man, that one man or woman can change the course of history, and as we see with Father Elijah, wipe the slate clean and build a nation, again, according to whatever whims, and taking the wasteland as the marble, essentially, or the stone from which to erect a new civilization. We've also seen that in House. House probably has the most far-sighted and ambitious vision out of all of these characters, but Caesar is no different. He basically represents an alternative to House's vision. House's vision is that of a libertarian techno-autocracy, and Caesar's vision basically is of a civilization tied to survival, which is built to last the situation of the post-apocalyptic. So you can say in many ways it actually draws, it's basically a less scientifically focused version of the master's plan. The whole master's plan in Fallout 1 was focused on the assimilation of all surviving humans into the unity which would be turned into super mutants who could resist radiation and were tough enough to survive the effects of the wasteland. The reason the master's plan failed is because he realized, or could be convinced to realize at the understand at the end, that they couldn't reproduce. And as a result of that, the whole plan was doomed to failure. In the same way that so much of the criticism of Caesar's Legion is focused on the idea that this is a system which is bent around the charisma of one man. And unlike House, Caesar, who basically eschews so much in the way of technology and has to import the technology, either in the case of the courier or someone like R.K. Gannon, basically to save his life, his mortality is a concern in the way that the mortality of the player is not. So everything here is drawn on a deliberate conception of history, looking to history from which to recreate the world in the vision essentially formed from the understanding of a single man. And yet, what does Caesar do in terms of being able to justify this? Having made himself Caesar, he sublimates his goals to a system of historical inevitability, to use the words of R.K. Gannon. And he employs a system known as Hegelian dialectics. In particular, this is the Lord Bondsman analogy from the phenomenology of spirit. I'm assuming that Caesar, the character, must have read that book. You can see that what do Gibbon, what do Caesar, and what do Hegel really have in terms of comparison? You can say that this is incongruous, that Hegel would be the one philosopher that Caesar decides to pick up in terms of his reading of Roman history. But that, in a sense, isn't fair, because if you read Hegel, Hegel's own theories are deeply indebted to classical thinkers such as Socrates and Plato and Heraclitus. And I'm just going to read a section from the Stanford bio on the Hegelian dialectics. World history is made up of histories of particular peoples within which spirit assumes some particular principle on the lines of which must run a development of its consciousness and actuality. So you can say again, the whole purpose of Caesar's Legion is to reach a process of actualization. Again, such the bizarre pursuit of this Roman authenticity. But like I said, Hegel would consider this to be an active spirit, whereas Caesar is basically playing both cards. He believes that this is a deliberate, conscious postmodern activity, yet he is also conceding the idea that the spirit which is emanating out of the historical Caesar's Legion may be something that ultimately eclipses him and surpasses him. But again, we can't really see that because Caesar is so associated with the Legion that the Legion itself can't really identify, especially in the words of Joshua Graham, without that charismatic personality. Just the same dialect that we have seen among operatives, shapes of consciousness in the phenomenology and among categories of thought determination in the logic can be observed here. A historical community acts on the principle that informs its social life, the experience of memory of this action and the consequences it brings. A memory coded in the stories that circulate in community results in this principle becoming available for the self-consciousness of the community that breaks the immediacy of its operation. The loss of immediacy brings about the decline of that community, but gives rise to the principle of a new community. So if we're going to look at this as a historical process and not simply a postmodern recreation of Rome, the acts, the social life, the experience, the memory would be that, as you can see on the image here, of creating Caesar's empire. It is not is not Rome itself, but rather it is the conquest of the 86 tribes that forms the memory of this action. And you can say it's Ulysses actually taking that memory and revolting against the attempt at Roman authenticity that forms the backstory for his character. It is looking at this and understanding that the experiences and memory of this community are actually found in total contradiction. But again, moving on from this, the idea that there has to be an immediacy, there has to be an impetus. And for Caesar, the immediacy, the impetus is conquering the Mojave. It is conquering Las Vegas. It is taking over Hoover Dam. And he is self-aware here. He understands that once Las Vegas is taken, once the Mojave is conquered, once the NCR is driven out, once he dies, the loss of that immediacy will bring about a new community. But that unfortunately runs counter, even if he believes that, it runs counter to his old stated mission, to his old principle, effectively. His principle is to form a society of flesh and bone which is able to weather the storms of the post-apocalypse. But the minute it becomes complacent, it becomes fat, it becomes attached to this idea of Vegas, which is the pure expression of profligacy, according to Caesar's Legion, then it becomes its own antithesis. It's not simply to identify that the NCR is the antithesis to Caesar's Legion, is that whatever synthesis will arise will ultimately eradicate the whole principle upon which Caesar's Legion will be established. So even if Caesar's Legion isn't defeated in terms of its military prowess, in terms of the battlefield, Caesar's Legion may also be defeated in terms of its society, like Rome, also becoming decadent. In rendering itself objective and making this being the object of thought, on the one hand, destroys the determinate form of its being, and on the other hand, gains a comprehension of the universal element which it involves, and thereby gives a new form inherent in its principle, which has risen into another, and in fact a higher principle. Essentially, the spirit, the history, has overtaken the intent. The dialectic linking concrete communities into a developmental narrative which shows the path of liberation for spiritual substance, the deed by which the absolute final aim of the world is realized in it. In Caesar's Legion, the absolute manifests in extreme violence. Contradiction and resolution inherent in the dialectic is ultimately the question of mastery and the struggle in death. And without this struggle, you can say that the whole basis of the society collapses. Now, on the one hand, you can say that there is so much of truth in terms of Hegel's analysis of what potentially this spirit of the historical community can achieve or ultimately will devolve into. But I do find it ultimately incongruous as to why Caesar himself would use this as an analogy. It would be far better coming from someone like R.K. Gannon, Archigenon even critiques Caesar's use of Hegelian dialectics from the point of view that he sublimates his ideology to that of a process of historical inevitability, i.e., Caesar is history, and thus it complements Caesar's own idea of infallibility. But the idea of history that Caesar has attached himself to is actually completely contradictory to what his own stated mission is. And so it would actually make more sense for Caesar basically to come out and be less verbose, less philosophical about it, and say, I am simply the agent of history. Rome is made reincarnate in my form, whatever, whatever. But it would be far more, I would say, consistent with the characterizations if it were instead someone like R.K. Gannon, who has a more, you can say, diffuse, diverse reading of various texts in opposition to Caesar, but ultimately they're drinking from the same well, which again, R.K. Gannon makes that reference to. They're both drinking of the period in spring. If he will be the one to refer to Hegelian dialectics, if he's really looking to a theory of historical determinism, in this historical determinism, he will ultimately find that the historical trajectory of his community leads to doom. And this is something on the lips of many, many characters, including that of Joshua Graham. So I am going to, because I'm running late and lowering, my voice is falling apart here. So I'm just going to summarize these points more clearly. I've already mentioned Elijah and this whole idea of the great man rising above the condition of the wasteland in order to make it anew. And indeed, it's actually, I hate to say this, but it's actually something which is briefly mentioned in Fallout 4, which is the only time I'm going to explicitly reference it, which is you complete a story in which there is the Cabot House quest. You take Lorenzo Cabot, and he mentions the fact that the apocalyptic world provides opportunities for great men. And effectively, that is the example afforded here. It is the perfect opportunity for Carlylean great men to emerge and shape the world as they see fit. Like I said, Elijah is one incarnation. Caesar is another incarnation. But Joshua Graham and Ulysses are, to be said, lesser incarnations. They are in many ways reactive as opposed to instigators as part of this grand historical process based around the volition or the achievement of the volition and the triumph of the will. In terms of drawing this to some connection with Vegas history, Joshua Graham, as I mentioned, was a Mormon missionary. A prominent facet of the Vegas geography is the Old Mormon Fort. It is the center of the followers of the apocalypse. It is where you find R.K. Gannon. During the last 10 years of Hughes's life, his empire was effectively run by something called the Mormon Mafia. Indeed, as we have the Jewish Mafia and the Italian Mafia in New Vegas, it is clear that Latter-day Saints also tried to exercise a significant influence on Vegas society. And it's clear that in the late 60s and 70s, through the use of Howard Hughes, they actually did achieve some form of control. So there is, interestingly enough, a continuity between the influence of Mormons outside of the Utah connection that's brought up in Honest Hearts, but actually extended over into Vegas itself. So just to summarize Honest Hearts, the player has the option of joining an organization called the Happy Trails Caravan Company to trek up to a society called New Canaan. New Canaan is basically the modern Salt Lake City in the same way that New Vegas is the modern Las Vegas. However, on the way, you are ambushed and your caravan is slaughtered by a group called the Whitelegs. You are drawn to Joshua Graham, who everyone thinks is dead. Having lost the first battle of Hoover Dam, he is drained and he burned and thrown off Hoover Dam. And as you can see, his features are again indicative of the torture which he suffered as a result of that, but he survived. And there's someone else in the chat who's actually mentioned this, which is the fire within me burnt brighter than the flames that encompass me, or something along those lines. So he comes off and he begins to lead a faction known as the Dead Horses. And there is another faction within the, if I remember correctly, the society on the way to New Canaan, called the Sorrows. And the whole basis is the interplay between these tribes. The Whitelegs have been joined by Ulysses that you see on the right, and they are basically petitioning to join with Caesar's legion, in the same way that the Great Khans are also petitioning to join Caesar's legion. And they're doing so by the eradication of New Canaan, basically trying to eliminate Joshua Graham's legacy, and in the hopes of killing Joshua Graham himself. And then, once that has been achieved, the dead horse has been crushed. The Whitelegs will probably think that they will become full allies with Caesar's legion, but as we know with the fate, they will be assimilated and their culture will be annihilated. But how does this pertain to Joshua Graham? Joshua Graham admits that he is no Caesar. He admits that he doesn't have a mind for logistics, that he couldn't succeed Caesar. And therefore, even Linnaeus, who was basically a later iteration of Joshua Graham, could definitely not succeed Caesar. But here, he is actually imitating and recreating the original conditions that established Caesar's legion. As I mentioned, Caesar basically began the legion by creating an alliance with the Blackfoot and using that basically as a means to go out and conquer and assimilate other tribes. Well, it seems that Joshua Graham is doing the exact same with the dead horses in Honest Hearts, and he is using the dead horses to be his own agent of terrible justice, and you can say civilization, against the Whitelegs. And just to quote him, because he comes out to the player and quotes Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. Remember, O Lord, the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it even to the foundation. O daughter of Babylon, who art to be destroyed, happy shall be that rewardeth thee as thou hast served us. Happy shall be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones. This, in terms of its, again, attempting to utilize religious fervor as the sword of justice in eliminating the Whitelegs for the travesties they have wrought upon New Canaan. Yes, this is being directed indirectly towards the legion through the Whitelegs, but it is using the legion's logic, albeit cast in a Mormon and ultimately into a broader Christian light, which is, instead of regarding this from the point of Roman morality and seeing New Vega society and the NCR as all profligates, instead that energy is instead being redirected and focused onto the Whitelegs. And so it seems that Joshua Graham doesn't actually have the self-awareness until the intervention of the courier that he is recreating the same conditions from which Caesar's legion was spawned, albeit he is using a different ideology, a different religious lens, but ultimately the result is the same. And either the player can intervene to eradicate the Whitelegs and their leader, Salts Upon Wounds, or he can decide to spare the man's life. The wild card within the story is what happened to the Sorrows, which again is, I'm not sure whether this is a form of sort of, I hate to sound like a leftist, but a white savior complex. The idea that there is a missionary called Daniel going to the Sorrows, he's trying to preserve this tribal culture because of its passivity, because of its pastoralism, because basically it represents innocence within the grand scheme of tribal identities. And in contrast, the dead horses represent, again, you can say this nascent resurgence of a Mormon incarnation of a Caesar's legion. And ultimately, I think very few people are going to come away with the idea that the Sorrows should retain their innocence. Again, this idea of basically preserving paradise within the small community, maintaining their less developed state, but doing so basically without the political interests or intrigue that's informed someone like Caesar's legion, so they don't become corrupted and become a society like the Great Khans. And the reason I say this is because, yes, you might want to retain this capsule of civilization, which is ultimately, you can say it's basically like the New Vegas equivalent of the Hobbits. It's a society which is anachronistic, which is wholesome, which is built around a other tribe. In the case of Lord of the Rings, it'd be the Dunedain, but in the case of Honest Hearts, it'd be the dead horses, guarding them to ensure that ultimately that innocence. So that is the question, and I think very few characters are going to be convinced of the idea that the sorrows can be kept in this sustained period of innocence for much longer. But that is one point really to mention in terms of how they're trying to comment on the tribal identity in this relationship between cowboys and Indians more generally. Now coming to Ulysses. He was a member of the Twisted Hares, which was a tribe which was assimilated into the Legion. When he was a frumentari, like Walpus and Coulter. He was there basically to contact tribes, form alliances, sabotage, assassinate, etc. Indeed, if we look at the modus operandi of Walpes in New Vegas, he was responsible for using treachery and subterfuge to massacre the town of Nipton, which cut off the supply lines from the Mojave outpost to Novak. He was responsible for smuggling a nuclear device into Camp Searchlight, which caused another NCR city basically to be destroyed. In the same way, Ulysses was there to coordinate attempts with the Whitelegs to attack New Canaan. But at one point, he had a change of heart. In response to his own military prowess, the Whitelegs began imitating him by replicating his braids, hence the twisted hairs. And the interesting thing is that regardless of what Caesar claims in terms of the brutal assimilation of the cultures they conquer, the braids are basically the symbol of Ulysses' own identity as part of the twisted hairs, and yet this assimilation for some reason did not extend to that part of his tribal identity which built up his identity, which essentially forms his post hoc, post-legion identity. And so when he sees the Whitelegs imitating that style, he is basically reminded that his tribal identity is stronger. And rather than taking this as a sign of affection, he takes this as a sign of everything that has been lost, everything that's been purged by Caesar's legion. And so he basically becomes a rogue agent. Indeed, he becomes obsessed with the figure of the courier. And you can almost say it forms part of a grand misunderstanding as I'm concerned, because he goes off and forms an understanding with a community in the West called the Divide, which was another supply route which linked the NCR with the Mojave Desert. But a nuclear device was taken over there and caused a massive detonation, which basically collapsed the society there and collapsed the supply route, which apparently was at the behest of Caesar. It is claimed by Ulysses that he found in there a civilization that combined elements of the Legion and combined elements of the NCR, that effectively it represented some form of microcosm. It was a paradise. The divide was a test case for what could be replicated everywhere, in the same way that Elijah looks to the Seraph Madre, in the same way that Caesar looks to the example of Rome. Ulysses looks to the example of the divide. And again, in terms of being able to actually trust his judgment and not to see his pseudo sort of philosophical and historical analysis sort of gloss over and elevate a culture more so than perhaps it's worth, he takes the decimation of this culture to form his own personal vendetta with the courier, because he believes the courier is responsible for transporting the device which doomed the society by cutting off this trade route. Now, it seems that what Ulysses is actually getting at in terms of a meta-narrative as it pertains to Fallout New Vegas is that this is the synthesis. This is the Hegelian synthesis between the NCR and the Legion. This is the coming together of the two-headed bear and the bull, which is the symbol of Caesar's legion, something that was destroyed. And as a result, his identity basically is formed around wiping the slate clean, eliminating both NCR and legion to begin again. Indeed, he takes the name Ulysses not from Odysseus, i.e., not a man who is trekking throughout the world following these adventures in order to get home, even though that again could be an analogy to his experience. He is taking Ulysses to mean General Ulysses, President Ulysses, Ulysses S. Grant, taking the two flags, the Confederate flag and the United States flag, and forming a new flag. Of course, despite his obsession with history, he should know that's complete bullshit, because it wasn't the two flags coming together and Ulysses S. Grant combining to form a new nation. Rather, it was the North conquering and subduing the South. So despite, again, all his appeal to history, it would seem that his, perhaps to some extent a bit like Caesar's, but I would say far more pronounced, Ulysses' version of history is more confused. And ironically, like Caesar, he also sublimates himself to a deification of the historical process, that he acts as an agent. He even considers his work in terms of opposing the courier and attempting to kill the courier. I'll finish history's work here. So you can say again, this is trying to comment that the synthesis exists, and maybe in the sense that people have looked to, I don't know, the Storm Cloak and the Legion conflict and said that it's intentionally pointless. Maybe Ulysses is trying to, again, make that contention that the conflict is deliberately pointless. But given the complete sort of stark and ideological differences between them, I don't really see how you can define it as pointless. I mean, ultimately, the parable between the two that link is they are both assimilationists. How can an unstoppable force meet an immovable object? One is desperate to assimilate and destroy the other, one in the name of democracy, one in the name of basically civilization, whatever that means in terms of this pursuit of Roman authenticity. So how can you take these two grand assimilationist forces and combine them together into a new thing? One will effectively mean the conquest of the other or the corruption of the other. We don't see if we're going to adopt the whole notion of Hegelian dialectics. But all of this is, again, basically a reflection of the courier. Because I mentioned all of these great characters. And again, the brilliance of New Vegas. You have all of these templates. You have all of these examples. And it's the decision is basically left to the courier, or at least it is in a meta sense, in terms of your self-writing of your character, because of course the game has to run on rails to a certain extent. The courier is left the opportunity to define the Mojave in their own image, like these characters, in also following the yes man mode and taking over New Vegas using basically the house plan. Where this idea falls short is that the courier, unlike these characters, is beholden basically to a rogue AI when it comes to Yes Man, who forebodingly basically comments that he is going to go back and reprogram himself to be more assertive and possibly undermine and destroy any of the courier's work that we see in the process of New Vegas. I think it's basically set there to act as some sort of warning against the player for having chosen this course, believing that they could basically become autocrats and act with impunity, that there is actually a cost for getting rid of House. But I think this is coming to a point about the limitations, because these are all the sort of narrative elements here. And I think the problem with Ulysses and the Lonesome Road, which is the final DLC for Fallout, yes, it's a commentary on the courier and everything the courier is supposed to represent in terms of the narrative of New Vegas. But I believe it was presented, I wouldn't say incompetently, but it's presented in a confused way. And in the end, I often just talk to Ulysses and say, this is all pointless. Can you stop doing this? And he agrees. So effectively, when we look at Dead Money, when we look at Honest Hearts, and when we look at, I mentioned old World Blues, they effectively all become gauntlets, which is everything that New Vegas isn't. New Vegas isn't a gauntlet. It's a very versatile sandbox in which the player can basically do whatever they want. They can kill any character they want. They can change alliances. They can influence factions. They can betray factions, whatever. They have 4 paths for which to complete the game. But the player is very much railroaded when it comes to the expansions. And I would say that again is it's something that really forms a disservice to the game, because I would love an opportunity to actually expand the choice, the role-playing elements of Fallout into these DLC. And just to take one example, I played a Legion character once, and I wanted to play the Honest Hearts DLC. And I wanted to play the Honest Hearts DLC because, as a true Legion supporter, I wanted to assassinate Joshua Graham. You go there, Joshua Graham says, yeah, you can assassinate me because I'll acknowledge player choice, but no one will acknowledge it. So I assassinate him. That turns everyone hostile. The White Legs are already hostile. I can't form an alliance with them. So basically, I have to kill another character to get a map and leave. And that is what I mean in terms of the short-sightedness of some of these DLC and expansion, is that there isn't an option left open for a Legion player. Even if you assassinate Joshua Graham, you get back and no one acknowledges you for your for your achievement, which is something that Caesar's been wanting to achieve now for 4 years. Like I said, in the same way that the Lonesome Road proves to be utterly pointless. If you talk to Ulysses and basically say this is all coming back to a misunderstanding on your part, um, then it comes to Dead Money and Old World Blues. Dead Money is, I think, better in terms of it being basically a story which is beyond that of the Courier. It is a story about all of these characters, Father Elijah, but also these dead characters such as Vera and Sinclair, but also the ghoul, who's basically the remnant of that period, but also sort of forms into this part of the broader entertainment community of Vegas, who is Dean Domino. And then you get to Old World Blues. Old World Blues, which tries to have allusions to the Mojave in terms of what the think tank, the little robots with the robots who are going to carve out and create this new sort of scientific endeavors or atrocities in the Mojave. Old World Blues is wonderful in the sense that it has all of these references. Again, I like surrealist and dark humor, and so from that point of view, you know, I love the expansion. Yet at the same time, despite all the creativity on display, it is just another gauntlet, and so I both love it and I hate it at the same time. So yes, 3 hours and 20 minutes in, and I am going to end it there and just read the super chats. So thank you everyone for listening. Unoriginal username for 4.99. For many of us, the road is a difficult one, but the path is always there for us to follow, no matter how many times we may fail. Fair enough. Thank you for the super chat. Unoriginal username again. Joshua Graham got me to reconnect with my faith. Okay. Did he convince you to become a Mormon? I'm not quite sure how so. I think he's a rather confused character, all things considered. Fumentari, the game led me to Christ. Okay. Thank you for the super chat. Ben Costa for $50. Thank you. That's very generous. Thank you, AM, for continuing your work. As for your series on the Habsburgs and the life of Dante, Morrowind, and now Vegas provides the viewers with an elevated understanding and context beyond the game. Well, I hope so. I hope I've provided that in the case. Like I said, it seems very disparate, and I'm sure the YouTube algorithm is going to punish me even more so, given how eclectic all of my things seem to be, even though I try to provide a through line for all of them. But thank you. Dylan198 for €5. You're a man of culture, AM. I'm glad you're doing an in-depth review of Fallout New Vegas, given that it's usually done by leftists. I don't know. I don't really watch. Like I said, I don't really watch historical YouTube. I don't really watch. I've watched one YouTuber called Oxhorn. All he tends to do is he does plot summaries, and then he tends to come up with some sort of libertarian moral analysis to something, which tends to be focused on supporting factions like the Minutemen, or focusing on things like supporting the NCR in a limited way or whatever. I don't really find it that interesting. As to what faction do you side with, I side with Mr. House. I think he's the I obviously disagree with the rampant degeneracy, yet at the same time, I believe he's the least worst option out of all of them. DC, €5. $5, thank you. And like I said, he's not pro-degeneracy in the sense he simply enables it. He's not actively sort of involved in it. But then again, that's not much of a caveat. DC for $5. This channel is fantastic and massively underrated. Extensive lore breakdown, contrast, historical references, top tier stuff. Thank you from Vegas. Well, thank you very much, DC. I don't think it's underrated. I'm actually surprised, given how impenetrable my style of sort of delivery is. I'm amazed that anyone can really understand it. So I'm very thankful to people who can. So thank you again for the super chat. If you can spare the time to speak at length about Ulysses and Symbols of Nations, I'd be very grateful. Well, like I said, I have, but I don't really find him that interesting. I find him quite long-winded and pretentious, and that's me saying it. I know what I'm talking about. I know what I speak when I say that. I also find the way he communicates to you in that garbled way through Eddie makes him very difficult to understand. In fact, I had to go through most of his dialogue for the stream and read it rather than listen back to it. And like I said, symbols of nations, I think what symbolism these nations represent is actually communicated more clearly by characters within the actual vanilla game than by Ulysses. And like I said, I think it ultimately comes down to a misunderstanding, which I find actually irritates me when it comes to doing the DLC profoundly. Right. Ugh the second. Okay, for £5. Brilliant and entertaining elucidation. Fallout London has come out. Sadly, though, I can no longer justify time needed to play. Well, I've lost all interest in Fallout. You know, I haven't played anything since Fallout 4, but I hope that's good. Phantom Spaceman for $10. Thank you very much. Great stream, AM. Would you ever consider giving the same treatment to the events of The Witcher? Tons of plot, factions, and political machinations at work. I'd love to see your take on this. Well, I've read a book of The Witcher. I've never actually played the game. So yeah, I'm not sure about that as I haven't played the game. Shreeved Goji for $20. Thank you. Thank you for your work, AM. Love learning about the models behind the sides in New Vegas. I found the talk on Ludwig II most beautiful. His life themes move me, especially as I too feel out of my time. Merry Xmas and go. Well, I'm very glad. I mean, I put a lot of work into that stream, and I'm glad that you enjoyed it. So thank you, and thank you for your generous super chat. Envida Surkaf for 50 Swedish krona. I've never played this game. I never got past the tutorial. It just never grabbed me, which is weird because I like the theme and ideas. Well, maybe this will give you the impetus to try again. The Eccentric Tripper for $5. Thank you. Do you prefer the total fantasy of Morrowind or the historical girding a thing like Fallout has? And VTM Bloodlines review then? When? Never. If I'm going to be perfectly honest, Fallout is easier to play than Morrowind. I love Morrowind more from a conceptual point of view and a mechanical point of view, but I still find it rather difficult and buggy to get through, which means, you know, I played this game a lot more than I played Morrowind. But they're incomparable because thematically they're completely different. When I was assessing Morrowind, I was assessing it more from a deep fantasy, looking at like medieval references. From this, I've been looking at the actual real world recreation and how history pertains so much in terms of reenactment and reading of history being a core component of the game. But thank you. Dylan98 for $6. I think Joshua Graham's voice actor is great, and I remember coming across an AI voice of him reading Caesar's Conquest of Gaul. It was a good listen. I'm sure that might be a good listen. Just a note on the voice acting. I think all the main characters, whether it be Caesar himself, I love the voice of House in particular. Even sort of voices like Chief Hanlon. There are great voice actors in the game, but there are a lot of incredibly mediocre voice actors. I think again maybe it's because of the rush development. There aren't enough voice actors for standard NPCs, and sometimes the care isn't taken to properly direct or enunciate in many of the lesser characters. But nevertheless, when it comes to the followers you can have, whether it be Boone, whether it can be Raoul, whether it could be, I mean, I'm not really going to include Lily in this list, but Veronica and Arcade, they all have an incredibly distinct character and voice given to them, which I think is rather compelling. It should be noted also in terms of the limitations of the game. I've already mentioned the short development time affected Caesar's Legion. The only, I mean, obviously, Lily doesn't count, but when it comes to the voice, when it comes to the followers, Raoul is the only character who is amenable to Caesar's Legion, and not because he's pro Caesar's Legion, but simply because he views them as a lesser evil in the wasteland compared to unbridled tribalism, of which he was so affected given the course of his life. Hence why Raoul hasn't really appeared in my analysis, despite the fact I like him as a character. Also, despite the fact his implications regarding the law pertaining to ghouls. So yes, that's another limitation, but just a quick note on the AI voices. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you everyone for listening. I'll actually be joining you this evening when I do my Ask Me Anything stream on the Habsburg series. So thank you again for listening, and good night.